Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the fourth meeting of 2026 in Session 6 of the Equalities, Human Rights and Civil Justice Committee. We have apologies this morning from Karen Adam and Tess White. Pam Gosel and Rhoda Grant are joining us remotely this morning, and you'll see them on the screen. So welcome to everyone sitting around the table. Our only public agenda item this morning is a continuation of taking evidence on our inquiry into neurodivergence in Scotland. This inquiry was precipitated by the Scottish Government's decision in 2024 to delay the introduction of a Learning Disabilities, Autism and Neurodivergence Bill. In this inquiry, we will be focusing on the experience of neurodivergent people in education, employment and the criminal justice system. And this morning we'll hear from two round tables, the first with a focus on education and the second with a focus on the workplace. So we'll begin this morning with our first round table, but before we move to questions from members, I'd like to introduce everybody to introduce themselves. I'll begin and then we'll move round the table from my right. My name is Maggie Chapman. I'm a Deputy Convener of the Committee and a Scottish Green MSP for North East Scotland region.
Good morning, I am Lynn Binney. I am Head of Education for the City of Edinburgh Council and I'm here in my capacity as Co-Chair of the ADES Inclusion Network.
I'm Hannah Axon. I'm Policy Manager at COSLA with a remit for mental health and wellbeing.
Hi, I'm Marie McNair. I'm an MSP in Clydebank and Mulgai in the west of Scotland.
Good morning, I'm Dr Jason Lang. I'm a clinical senior lecturer in neurodevelopment at the University of Glasgow, consultant child and adolescent psychiatrist, autistic person, dad to an autistic daughter, so lots of hats to wear today, I'm afraid.
Thanks, Jason.
Hi, my name is Marie Harrison. I am Service Manager for the Children's Views Service, which sits as part of Children in Scotland, and our primary function is to support children with additional support needs to share their views in education disputes.
Thanks.
Maura Kearney, Principal Educational Psychologist in Renfrewshire, and I'm here on behalf of the Association of Scottish Principal Educational Psychologists.
Thanks, Maura.
Yeah, I'm Paul McLennan. I'm the MSP for East Lothian. I was previously a councillor in East Lothian for 15 years.
Thanks, Paul.
I'm Angela Evans. I'm from the Donaldson Trust. I am the current head teacher of our Sensational Learning Centre, which is a grant-aided special school for primary and secondary pupils.
Super. Thank you. And moving online, Pam.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Pam Gosel. I'm a Scottish Conservative member of the Scottish Parliament for the West region.
Thanks, Pam. Rhoda.
Hi, I'm Rhoda Grant. I'm Labour Party MSP for the Highlands and Islands.
Thanks, Rhoda. And Gerard.
Hello, I'm Gerard Rilke. I'm a special education teacher representing the Educational Institute of Scotland.
Super. You are all very welcome, and thank you for that, everyone. And just to say to Gerard and members online, if you want to come in at any point, please just indicate in the chat, and the clerks will let me know, and we'll bring you in if it's not if I don't catch your eye. Okay, I refer members to papers 1 and 2 for our meeting, and we'll now move to questions from members, and I'll kick things off. When we're talking about access to assessments, to diagnosis and post-diagnosis support, we know that there are very long waiting times. We know there are the process, the pathways for assessments can be very, very lengthy if they exist in your geographic location at all. And I suppose really my first question is, how can schools ensure that pupils receive support throughout the process of diagnosis, but also the support they need regardless of whether they have diagnosis or not? And I don't know who wants to come in first. Lynn. Yes, thank you.
Education is governed by the Additional Support for Learning Act. which ensures that we meet the needs of learners with additional support needs. Therefore, technically, a diagnosis should not matter with regards to the support that education offers for children and young people. The support should be put in place. Largely, it's identified by the class teacher, and there's lots of different levels of support that can be put in place, and that is recorded often in a child's plan, which is the way that we take forward the GARFEC framework in Scotland. So with regards to education, we feel very strongly that our legislation it allows children to have their needs met in the classroom, regardless of that diagnosis.
Thanks, Lynn. Yes, Angela.
I think schools are becoming that point of early identification for neurodivergence, and they are becoming the gateway to diagnostic pathways, where we know that often they need that diagnosis to access that wider health and social care support. I think it comes down to having that holistic approach. So if I think about Donaldson's, we're not looking at solely a diagnosis, we're looking at the wider support needs of the pupil, and it often comes down to the reasonable adjustments that we have in place. If we don't have reasonable adjustments in place, neurodivergent learners are at risk of distress, of disengagement, of not attending. And I think it's a reminder that reasonable adjustments for these pupils are statutory, they're not optional. And when they're delayed or inconsistent or dependent upon diagnosis, neurodivergent learners can disengage from school. At Donaldson's, reasonable adjustments at Donaldson's, they are anticipatory. They're not reactive, they're not dependent upon diagnosis. They are put in place in response to individual sensory well-being, regulation, communication needs. They're reviewed regularly. These are the things that ensure that we are meeting the needs of our young people. We know there's significant wait times for an ADHD or autism diagnosis, and I think the impact of that on schools is we have teachers doing their absolute best to support the needs of neurodivergent learners, but often without the supports and services around them that they need.
Thanks, Angela. Gerard, I know you want to come in, and then I'll come to you. I'll come back in the room. Gerard, over to you.
Yeah, it's just regarding the EIS. We did a survey in 2024 called, it was an all-member survey, and one of the questions in it was, what extent are children and young people in your setting able to access frontline support services at the point where the support need is identified? Now, that came back as 45% occasionally, 28% sometimes, 12% never, 9% frequently, and 1% all the time. Now, the additional comments in relation to this question, that further emphasised views that waiting for support is having a negative impact on that young person. So here's a couple, for example. We have a significantly high number of children in our school with additional needs, and the amount of referrals we have to write and manage is very difficult. Most of these are then rejected, and the process then has to start again to another service. We also had comments from members in rural parts of Scotland and island communities, and they felt that services had become overly centralised. And as a result, that was making it challenging for pupils and, well, parents and their children to attend appointments. And one thing we'll have to bear in mind is that not all additional support needs are medical or diagnosable in nature, but many are. In those cases, early diagnosis is helpful. The current delays between the different stages of support, highlighted by the members above, and caused in part by shortage in specialist staff, that also accessing CAMS and educational psychology service is unhelpful to the child and to the young person. That's all I've really got to say on that just now.
Thanks, Jade. And just to say, I know we are going to unpick and explore some of the issues that you've already mentioned in a little bit more detail, but I'll go to Jason for now.
Yeah, so I have to try and separate my research from personal experience because I have both, so I'll try and do that explicitly. The research that we have, the research information that we have from projects we've carried out is that while the laws governing access to support are laudable, they are often not met, and there is generally a culture expressed to us that, number one, you need to fail before you are able to get support, and that causes damage to young people. So there's no anticipation, or very limited anticipation, of problems. And while it is often said that you don't require a diagnosis to access support, in practice, that's not what parents tell us. It's not my experience. I sat in school meetings and been told my daughter can't access A or B. It's not my daughter, sorry, a friend that we were representing can't access A or B because she doesn't have a diagnosis. So while it's laudable that that is supposed to be the case, I think the truth on the ground is that it's not. There is a huge waiting time to access diagnosis, or I prefer to say identification, to be identified as being somebody who is neurodivergent. That also requires significant amount of work. But there is, and we're working on that in other fields to try and reduce the time that takes, because I think that's the primary problem, is potentially over-assessment. However, there is also an issue coming as a child psychiatrist between giving that diagnosis and then how that integrates into school. So there are two separate services. And health, it's very difficult as a health professional to talk to school and say, we think you should do X and Y, because that's not our jurisdiction. We don't know what school can or can't do. And so actually I've long thought that really what we need is a proper liaison bridge. So, for example, integration of educational psychologists into neurodiversity identification teams, where there's somebody who can speak educationese, if you like, somebody who knows what what's available and what's possible. Because we can make suggestions, but they may not be practical, they may not be appropriate to schools, and we're also starting to be in danger of treading on professional boundaries, which isn't helpful to anybody. I guess the other thing that I think is worth saying is that we know from our research that 223,000 children within Scotland are unable to regularly attend school, and it's likely that the majority of those children are neurodivergent children who can't attend. And that's an absolutely huge number. So I think what we are interested in is not the question of whether children can receive support in school, which often translates to, can you be a bit more neurotypical and thus fit into a neurotypical around system, but shouldn't we be thinking, is the system right? So previously I've said I think there's 43% of children and young people identified with additional support needs within education at present, or the most recent figures. That seems unreasonable. That seems, it doesn't follow logic that 43% of children require additional support to access learning. And I made a bit of a meme, if you like, which was, if you owned a supermarket and 43% of your customers couldn't reach the shelves, what would be the problem that you had? And it might not be appropriate to tell them to reach harder, which often happens, unfortunately. That's what parents tell us. Reach more, try harder, do better. I have an email sitting in front of me from my daughter's school which says exactly that in as many words, and I think I've submitted that to the inquiry previously. We could employ lots of people with step ladders to help people get up the shelves to reach them. That's currently what we kind of do. So people run around with step ladders, additional support needs, supports, reasonable adjustments. They hit some people, they don't hit others. They are, in my personal experience, inconsistently followed. My daughter is not able to attend education anymore at the age of 15 because she had reasonable adjustments in place that were systemically ignored by the school from time to time, which for an autistic person is completely devastating, because you don't know when it's going to be okay and when it's not going to be okay, and that fear of uncertainty and is very destabilising. Or your other option is to redesign your shelves, bring them down to the level where people can actually access them. So is the problem with 43% of children with additional support needs and 223,000 children not attending a sign of a problem with neurodivergence, or a problem with the design of a system which doesn't allow a large chunk of the society to access what is rightfully theirs? My daughter was offered two 2 periods of outside of school attendance with a support teacher, and that was described to me as a good offer. And as a parent, I said, well, number one, it's not an offer, it's a right that she has, so you shouldn't be offering us anything. Number two, if I bought a car from Arnold Clark and paid full price for it, and you brought me 2 seats and a steering wheel, would you think that that was a good offer? So that was my response to school. I think that you'll find that there are lots of parents, and we find them in our research, who say the same thing. Qualitative research in this area, it reaches saturation at interview n equals 1. So, in other words, once you've done one interview, every single parent almost tells you the same story. You change the dates, the times, but it's the same repetitive story. And what it results in is a huge number of neurodivergent young people not able to engage in society, a huge number of neurodivergent young people who feel excluded from society. It results in Polment having more than 50% of young people with a diagnosis of ADHD, and potentially it's much higher than that. It results in only 20% of the adult population who are autistic, who want to work, being able to work. It results in potentially up to 43% in some studies of completed suicides having a background of an autistic neurotype to them in psychological postmortems. So there's significant evidence that neurodivergent people are excluded from society systemically. And the problem is not how do we support them to be more neurotypical. The problem is how do we think about our systems in the long term to mean that everybody can actually access them.
Thanks very much. You've given us a lot in there, Jason. Appreciate that. I want to bring a couple more people in, and then I might come back on some of the things some people have said. So, yes, Hannah.
I'd probably echo what Len said at the start of sort of the legislative underpinning for the way that education works, and then highlight the unprecedented levels of need that we're currently dealing with across the system, which has placed additional pressures on education. We did a review. There's a neurodevelopmental service specification for children and young people, which outlines what our sort of holistic approach would look like. And we did a review of its implementation with government. It was published last year. And there were a number of challenges found in that. One was the front loading. That's not the best of phrasing, but of the ask into education around sort of I suppose the preliminary assessment and diagnosis, and the filling out of different pieces of information that health require. So I think education are potentially putting more work into this than has ever been put in before in that space. So I think that's useful to acknowledge the demand that it's placing on education. Part of that review, we found sort of the level of resourcing being really challenging with the additional need. There has been no additional resource necessarily coming in, certainly not as a result of the neurodevelopmental specification ask. So the financial resource, but also the staffing resource being a real challenge. As we conducted that review, what came through some of the surveys was, I suppose, a lack of clarity in terms of what the roles of different stakeholders are in relation to supporting children and young people. So you will have what education are doing, you will have what health are doing, but they don't necessarily marry up. And I think Jason pointed to a sort of lack of clarity around perhaps what health think education might do. Potentially what that results in is really unclear expectations for children, young people and families. So we found, coming back through local authorities, that child has been on the waiting list for a long time. The school has put the support around the child that they are able to put around them. They've gone to CAMS and have been sent back the way for support from the school with the sort of CAMS anticipation that there will be more, and there isn't, and that has been sort of bad for relationships all round. So I think what's also come through is sort of a need for clarity and clear communications and a whole system understanding. One of the recommendations of the review was to develop sort of a high-level descriptor of what the system might look like and what sort of support children and young people might require. And we talk about pathway a lot, but it's almost not all children necessarily need to go from one end to the other. So what would be required at each point, and how might that then go on to be interpreted locally, because it would still require local interpretation. So I think that there's quite a lot of information in that review about the challenges that we're seeing in terms of deliveries. There's a number of points in there I'd probably point to.
Thanks, Hannah. That's really helpful. I'll go to Marie next.
Thank you so
and
much.
then Maura.
I think what we're finding in our very direct work with children and young people is that there is a distinct implementation gap between this wonderful, beautiful policy and legislation we see in Scotland. And as a Danish person coming over here, I think Scotland has a lot to be proud of. I think you have an incredibly dedicated workforce of teachers and pupil support assistants, etc., that are doing absolutely everything they can. I think you have legislation and policy that really wants to do right by children and young people. But I also think the ask on local authorities to deliver what it says in the legislation they have to deliver is not realistic with what they have available to them. I don't think anyone sets out in the morning to harm children or to put children in a situation where they're not able to benefit from their education. Everybody wants to do the best they can. But the gap between the promise and what's actually realistic is just far, far too wide. I think what happens when you have a situation like that is that parents, children and young people become very frustrated, very agitated, because they can see where we should be able to access these services. We should be able to have an education that caters to our needs, but that's not possible. And then you see an over-reliance potentially on processes such as the additional support needs tribunals, which leads to increased costs for local authorities, making it even harder for them to deliver the services they're meant to. We would beg everybody to try to focus and support families to access non-judicial routes to dispute resolution, such as independent advocacy services, mediation services, views gathering services, to get in and support children and families and those educational relationships as early as possible. And some things are available in Scotland. We have the My Rights, My Say project, which I'm heavily involved with, and we can do a lot through these processes. We can't do everything. But it's an area where I think, in the light of the UNCRC as well, coming into legislation in Scotland, further funding in these routes would be really, really helpful. And the original question was, what can schools do to support these processes? A big part of that for me would be work closer with the third sector, try to put us in a position where we can do more to support everything that's already going on. Something Jason said really resonated with me, that the whole structure around education seems inadequate. You have 43% of children and young people now identified as having additional support needs, and I think largely we have an education system that was sort of set up back in the 1900-something as a response to industrialization. Now, that society, we have transcended that. The lives children and young people live today are very, very far removed from the lives of the children that education was set up to cater to. So I think there is an element of a lot of conversations, a lot of reviews and a lot of inquiries trying to respond sort of piece by piece to the very, very big structural difficulties we're faced with. And I think we potentially need to think bigger than that.
Thanks very much. Maura, yes, you want to come?
Just going to say, in terms of the structures that we work within, there has been increased pressure. We have seen, in relation to additional support needs, we have seen locally and nationally the number of children who have been identified as having neurodivergence triple over the last 5 years. So you can imagine the pressures within the system. We also have, in terms of wider additional support needs, parents with mental health issues, children with mental health issues. So that 43%, we can see it across a variety of needs. I suppose, taking on board Jason's point about educational psychologists and health colleagues working closer together, there is a significant amount of assessment within the school system as it is. So when a child goes into an ASL provision, and they can access that with or without diagnosis, as they can access assessment or training for staff, etc. We have that information, and I think we do need to work at less siloed ways, and that we're providing that information for health colleagues. I don't know that it would be a fully integrated team. There is a huge amount of work within local authorities and within schools that we are directly providing. But yes, I do think that there needs to be closer working in relation to that.
Thanks, Maura. Yes, Angela, did you come back in?
At Donaldson's, we work very closely with a speech and language therapist. So she is employed by Donaldson. She's with us 4 days a week. We have a play therapist that we work really closely with. We work closely with educational psychologists from local authority. and we really see the benefits of that joined up working. I think time is a significant equity issue just now around diagnosis, and it has such a significant impact on the well-being and inclusion of neurodivergent learners. I think neurodivergence is becoming overlapping, it's complex, and I think approaches such as right help, right time, right place, they absolutely appropriately focus on need and not diagnosis, but I think we also need to look at the sustained pressure it's putting on schools, and I do think it exposes a gap between inclusive policy intent and the lived experiences of teachers and neurodivergent learners in the classroom.
Thanks, Angela. Jason, you want to come back in?
Yeah, just on that point, I think it's important, and I agree with what Maura said. I mean, it might not be integrated systems, although I think that would be a gold standard if we could work out how to do that. But at least liaison bridges would be better than what we have at the moment. In terms of what a diagnosis, if you like, I mean, a diagnosis adds validity for young people, and one of the things that we are very concerned about is talk about just providing support, and I've heard it before that says something along the lines of, well, having a diagnosis doesn't make any difference to what we do in school, for example. Now, there's an issue with that, because having a diagnosis, or better, an identification, tells you your make and model. So that's really what we're working out. We're working out people's make and model, and if you have a car, sorry, I use a lot of metaphors, and I know as an autistic person I'm not allowed to, but if you bear with me a second, if you have a car and you don't know whether it runs in petrol or diesel, then you're going to have problems. You need to know what a child's neurotype is like before you can start to design environments that will suit them. And to Marie's point, what I think is really important to say about school systems. I don't ever want to come across as being critical to teachers, because I think sometimes, you know, we can be misinterpreted as saying teachers don't. So I completely agree that teachers are working flat out more than is probably compensated to them in terms of pay and resources. They are, for the most part, all doing their absolute best in a system. But there are a couple of issues. One is that the system as it stands just now is, you rightly said, designed with a single door of entry and a single door of exit. And that doesn't work for neurodivergent people. You mentioned that somebody mentioned that we have a much higher number of neurodivergent people, but I think the truth is that that's a much higher number of people identified as being. There's not really, we don't have any evidence to say that there has been some increase, some magical thing that's happened that's increased the number of autistic kids or the number of children who are neurodivergent. It's more likely that neurodivergent children are the canaries in the coal mine. They are the early casualties of a system which doesn't work for them. Anything that destroys a neurodivergent child irritates at least a neurotypical or so-called or more neurotypical person. And the other issue that we identified within our Neurodiversity in Scottish Schools project is that while teachers are super well-meaning and they want to do what they can, there are two significant limiters. One is that the school's outcomes are measured solely on exam attainment, pretty much. Maybe a little bit of positive destination, but as far as we can tell, positive destination can be spun as anything. It's not prison. Well, I slightly exaggerate, but it's not far off that. So even volunteering one afternoon a week without pay would be potentially squeezed in as a positive destination. But for the most part, it's all on exams. Now, within the University of Glasgow, we don't measure. I'm not measured on exam techniques. I'm measured on my students' satisfaction survey. And there's the university, you know, exam results are exam results, right? What the university is interested in is what is the student's satisfaction, what's the student's experience, what's the health and well-being of the student. That's really what I'm measured on in my PDP within my job. And I think that is really important, because what head teachers told us is we know what we want to do in schools, we know how we want to change stuff, we know what we could do, but we can't do that because the only thing I'm measured on, keeping my job, is number of National 5, grade C and above, or whatever it is. Yeah. So that's an issue, because you can't do that unless, so if you're somebody with ADHD, you can't attain success in that system without medicating yourself or doing something that makes you more neurotypical. The only way to pass exams currently is to sit for 2 or 3 hours in a hall concentrating on one thing. That's the only route to success, essentially, for children. For autistic children, the increase in the number of social interactions within the curriculum, so having to do group work, having to do... I mean, when I was at school, we were very much in rows. The teacher told us what to do, you worked on it, that was that. Whereas the system has changed significantly over time, where there's much more social interaction required, significant demands on neurodivergent people, and it might be, we don't know, that these are the things that are gradually raising the threshold of children becoming unstuck, if you like. So I managed through life, not great, but I managed through school as an autistic person without being identified as autistic. But my schooling system is very different to the one my daughters try to engage with. Very, very different indeed. And so, you know, there are other... Argentina, all the children don't change classrooms every 50 minutes. The teachers change classrooms every 50 minutes. So if you've got crushes in your corridor, which is one of the reasons, another reason my daughter can't go to school, there's 2,700 or something pupils in a building, you know, it's too small. I mean, you would never put yourself through that. It wouldn't happen in the Scottish Parliament. You wouldn't have that number of people crushing into corridors. You know, you just wouldn't tolerate it. But we somehow tolerate it in schools. That's destructive for neurodivergent, particularly autistic children in that case. So there's systemic questions that we could ask. Why do we not move 57 teachers then? Right, we could move 57 teachers every 50 minutes. There'd be no crushes in the call. An Argentina system, for example, that's what they do. So there are things that we could learn, I think, from other places. There are. I bring it back again to system issues, measure targets. If you suddenly ask schools to measure health and well-being of their pupils and forget exam results, I mean, the evidence suggests that exam results would actually follow anyway, but, you know, because happy learners do better, right? But the issue we have is a system designed for something, and laudable government policies, as Marie said, that are aimed at inclusion into a system which is fundamentally not designed to include. It's designed to exclude. Not intentionally, but the design causes that. You can't put square pegs into round holes.
Thanks. I was going to bring Rhoda in on reasonable adjustments, but given that we've started on education and curriculum and exams, Paul, do you want to come in with your question?
Yeah,
and then
I'll come on in the question and kind of just a comment as well, because we've had various discussions, and this is at council level and so on as well. I suppose one of the key things I think for all of us is in terms of how do we triage, because it's almost like who comes first, because it's just, and I think we've all talked about the increase. How do you triage that, I think, is a really important question. In terms of that, excuse me, and I think the other part of it is, how do we then talk around about, I suppose it's assessing demand. We've seen the demand in the last number of years increase. Is that going to be just an exponential increase in the next number of years as well? So where we can kind of say, look, what we need to do in this situation, I think is important, but what can we do to almost say, like, okay, in the next 3, 4, 5 years, this increase is going to go up that. And I think, so that was the question on that, first of all. So I don't know who wants to answer that question, Maggie, and then I'll maybe come in just on the question, just on the back of that as well, but very briefly, if I wouldn't mind answering that.
Maura, I know you want to come in on the education thing, but I will bring you back. Lynn, did you want to come in on that?
In terms of numbers and the exponential growth that we are all seeing across local authorities and nationally with regards to additional support needs, I think there are conversations happening in different places that the ADIS are part of to try and explore and unpick that. We see across most local authorities an increase in the secondary compared to the primary, and I think that's a result of increased identification, but also some of the structural changes and the structural issues we have in our secondary. I think it is important that we need to remember that for professionals working in education, our additional support needs categories are very wide and diverse and do not only include children with autism and ADHD, which are typically the two conditions contained under the neurodiverse, but also children who have English as additional language, children who are young carers, our care experienced children and young people, those with dyslexia and dyscalculia, of which I would consider a neurodivergent need. So the class teachers in all of our classes in every school in Scotland have a high number of children with additional support needs. Here in the city of Edinburgh, we have schools with up to and including 80 to 90% of children with additional support need. So the work that we do in local authorities, including educational psychology, is to try and look at those issues, to remove barriers to learning and to make our curriculum and our pedagogy as inclusive as we possibly can. Will we see a reduction in that over time? I'm not so sure, and we are having discussions internally as to whether we need to look again at that legislation and look at giving clearer guidance on the categories. And the other thing that we are seeing, certainly in my time being involved in this work, is the comorbidity, the amount of children who not only have autism and ADHD and dyscalculia, as well as mental health issues. So what our class teachers and what our schools are coping with is really complex social problems and issues. And they are looking and trying the best that they can to reduce those barriers to learning and allow those children and young people to access the learning in the class. I don't know with our current legislation as to whether we will see a reduction in those numbers. If anything, I'm predicting that they will continue to increase. But I think we need to look below those numbers and truly look at what it is telling us. Recent Scottish Government figures tell us that the majority of those children with additional support needs are having their needs met in the classroom. And it is the class teacher, through differentiation and practice, that is putting the reasonable adjustments in place to having those needs met. And very few of our children and young people are educated in the special school sector in Scotland, 2 to 3%, much lower in some local authorities. So understanding our data and the needs underlying gives you a sense of the complexity of which our schools are dealing with. And I think that then, as Hannah pointed out, the challenge around the resourcing of that within local authorities, ensuring that our workforce have the skills that they need, including our teachers and our support staff, and also understanding that because of the numbers and the demand on services as well as education are increasing thresholds for support because they have to. So there's a real there's a complexity underneath those figures.
Jason, I was going to bring yourself in next because the question I was going to ask was around about, and you can touch on it because it's around about, do we have the curriculum and approach to exams that suit neurodivergent pupils? You said obviously it's not. Can we tailor that, and how do we do that? Because again, it comes back to the point I think you mentioned, Linda, is around about, because I've had discussions in meetings with parents at schools as well, and they're always talking about the child's plan and individual plan. That becomes hard when you're talking about the increase that's there, about trying to then, if you're trying to fit in a number of kids' plans into the multi-complex kind of school curriculum and year, it becomes incredibly tough to try and do that. So I suppose, and Jason, you mentioned it, what can we do to try and make sure that curriculum suits everybody? It's not just in terms of, here's the typical curriculum and it suits everybody, and you're almost looking for neurodiverse kids to fit into that rather than another way about, and that's the real challenge, I think. So, but I'll come to yourself first of all, Jason, and then open that up on that particular point.
Sure, thank you. I just wanted to pick up, because it's relevant, some issues. So that there's an issue of we have to be very careful how we interpret data. I'm not sure that it's certainly not consistent with our findings that the vast majority of neurodivergent children have their needs catered for within education. That's not consistent with our findings at all. We also, colleagues of ours, had to work very hard to gather that 223,000 number, because it's not always equally reported. So different local authorities report absence in different ways. There's huge inconsistencies. There was a lot of freedom of information requests, etc., done to gather that in as scientific a way as possible. So I think we just have to be very cautious, because I think while that is said, it is fundamental, and I'm willing to be taken wrong here, but from other organisations that we work with, it's fundamentally not what we hear on the ground in the experience of parents. We also have to be cautious of that data, because we will hear a relative bias of people who talk to us are people with problems, right? So you have to just be careful with the data and make sure that we are definitely comparing apples with apples. To your point, can you change the curriculum? Yes, in Scotland almost very nearly did with the Curriculum for Excellence, and it didn't in the end. I refer you to the OCED report on the implementation of Curriculum for Excellence. So what would work? Are there other ways of doing things Yes, clearly there are. I'm a consultant psychiatrist, and following my membership exams, I have not sat another exam. Yet I'm allowed to practice medicine. I do portfolio learning. The airline pilots that fly you around, they pass their initial courses for sure, but after that it's a number of successful landings, number of takeoffs, reflective practice, submit a portfolio, have your licence continued. So we already have significant, risky jobs, if you like, completed by people who use portfolio learning examples. So do we have to sit exams? I'm not sure that we do. Are there other ways in which we can do assessment? Within the university sector, we're doing that hugely. We've shifted away from examinations, certainly closed book examinations, to much more neurodivergent friendly approaches. We have to be careful of continuous learning, because that can be a real problem for people with ADHD, because it's just a series of continuous demands. Every month there's another demand, another demand. If you fall behind with one, you end up... So that we have to be careful of that. But portfolio learning, demonstrating learning outcomes, is really what we want to do to prove that somebody has learned something. So are there other ways in which you can demonstrate? Yes. Are there potentially systemic changes which you could do to encourage that? Yes. So you could change the standards that schools are measured by, for example. So these are things that we discovered in our NIS, or we've put together in our NIS framework. We think that potentially culture change within schools, so shifting away from the deficit focus, because the other thing is historically we've always thought about neurodivergence, and I've heard it mentioned here a couple of times, these conditions, comorbidity. We've always thought it comes from that sense of there's something that needs to be corrected. There's an internal narrative which we've all been steeped in over many, many years, which is the psychomedical model of deficit around autism. That's how you're diagnosed with autism. I have a deficit in this, I have a deficit in that, I have a deficit in the next thing. But actually, what we really ought to expect is that everybody in this room is genetically different. We all have different fingerprints, we all have different DNA. Why would we expect our brains to be wired in exactly the same way and function in exactly the same way? So that's the concept of neurodiversity. We're all diverse. Mention complexity, but it's not really complexity per se. It's just that humans are complex individuals. And diversity, we also have to get away from this siloed idea. So that's another legacy problem that affects schooling, is that we have a sense that we do these things for autistic children. We do these things for ADHD children. I refer you to the Autism Toolkit or Toolbox, or whatever it's called, for example. There is no child who is autistic only. I mean, if there is, they're vanishingly rare. What we know is that all neurodivergence overlaps. ADHD and autism almost always go hand in hand, at least to trait level, if not completely to diagnostic level. But dyslexia, dyscalculia, dyspraxia, they're all in a mix. And so everybody's neurotype is slightly different. If I can be personal about me, I have a diagnosis of autism. That's my primary neurotype. But there are chunks of my brain, how it functions, which is ADHD, bits of ADHD in there. There are definitely bits of dyspraxia. I'm a consultant psychiatrist, but I could not tie my shoelaces until I was 12 years old. And I still can't fit things together. Right? I can't see how, like me doing IKEA furniture, disaster, right? It's just not for me. I'm learning Spanish just now, and I'm remembering how there are aspects of dyslexia in there in terms of hearing sounds and being able to translate those sounds into written words, which I've largely at 49 years old overcome in English, but they come back. So we're all a mix, and neurodivergent people tend to be a mix of lots of different neurotypes. In answer to, will the figures continue to rise? I suspect they might, because unless we do, so there's two things here that we said to the summit with the Minister as well. One is that you need an immediate action plan to reduce waiting times and get people through the system. That's a crisis that you've got. You've got 5-year, possibly more waiting times. I suspect that, again, remembering that figures always get massaged coming up, the published figures are probably most likely a little bit shorter than the reality for most people's experiences. I think that needs to be dealt with. That's a short-termism measure, and if we just do that, if we just keep doing the same thing again and again, essentially we've got ourselves into this situation. And so if we keep doing what we're doing, we will not get out of it. So I think that equally there has to be long-term work in how we change culture, how we change structure. That's across society. That's not just for education. An example would be work that's occurred since the 1960s, 70s in LGBTQI communities, for example, or in the whole of society in relation to LGBTQI. In all of our lifetimes in this room, mental illness included homosexuality in the diagnostic descriptors and the diagnostic manuals. It was only removed, I think, in the possibly late 70s, early 80s, something like that. I can't remember exactly when, but it was in diagnostic manuals of mental illness. The same as autism and ADHD and all the rest of it are currently in diagnostic manuals as mental disorders. Thankfully, time moves on. And if we were having this discussion in 1929, the rate of autism would be 0 because we hadn't defined it as a thing. But to think that the number of autistic people that existed at that time was 0 is fallacy. It's not true. So, will the numbers keep going up? Yes. Does it matter? You know, there's another question about it factors into some of the stuff coming out from the United States. You know, I can't believe that more than 10% of people are autistic. And the question that we don't know the answer to is how many autistic people should there be in the world? How many neurodivergent people do you think there should be? Because we don't know that. All we know is how many people are identified. So it's more likely that the numbers of people requiring identification is a sign that your system is not working for that group of people. And now there's a name for it. So the other thing we have is hermeneutical injustice. So if you have an injustice that's perpetrated upon you, but you can't name it, you don't know what it is, then you can't do anything about it. Does that make sense? Whereas now we have a name for this and people identify, oh, that's a bit like me. Maybe that's what's happening. And I think that's most likely the explanation for the rise in identified need. Maybe more widely, we've also got more acute societal level stress, I would argue. So I think that we look at cost of living problems, we look at post-austerity issues, there's something to be said for if the level of anxiety is high amongst the population as a whole, neurodivergent people are the canaries in the coal mine. It's likely to be hitting that group harder.
Thanks, Jason. Maura, you've been waiting to come in.
I was going to say, if we're arguing for fewer exams, I think it would support lots and lots of young people across the system. And whilst exam results are a predictor of later life success, I don't think they're the only metric that educationalists value. Absolutely not. I think we have a national health and wellbeing survey, we have local health and wellbeing surveys, we have often classroom health and wellbeing surveys. So it is a hugely important kind of aspect of thinking about the child holistically, and I think the vast majority of schools engage with that. I did a study about, it's quite a few years ago, and it was looking at the number of local authorities that were engaging in nurturing approaches. That's whole school nurturing approaches, and at that point there was about 30 out of 32 local authorities. And people see that really as the basis for how they support children's health and wellbeing. And within that, it's not only just about a nurturing approach, it's also about a language and communication friendly approach. It's about using NATE materials, which is about changing attitudes, because a nurturing school should be inclusive of children with any additional support need. So whilst I am not saying that there's not an emphasis on outcomes in terms of qualifications authority outcomes, I think it is part of a bigger picture, and every head teacher that I would speak to would say they need to get the ethos, they need to get the nurturing approach correct before anybody learns within that environment. So I do think it's a strong kind of focus within our schools and establishments.
Thanks, Marie. And then Angela, I'll bring you back in, and then we'll move to Rhoda.
I'll try to be quick. I just wanted to address both your points around assessments, potential exams, and also the triaging. The very wonderful Sir Ken Robinson said that we have a problem in the world because we only educate children from the waist up. Like, we're so preoccupied with their heads that we forget about their bodies. And I think that speaks to what you're saying as well, Maura, about, it would be really interesting to look at alternative ways of getting assessments and exams rather than relying on this quite archaic way of assessing intelligence. Intelligence is much more diverse than we give it credit for. There's so many ways our young people could shine, but at the moment it's sort of Ken Robinson says as well, we're educating everyone to become a university professor, but we don't need a world full of university professors. We need everybody to be able to shine in their own way. There was the Hayward Review, the Louise Hayward Review a while back, with some very neuro-affirming ideas around what exams and assessments could look like. A large chunk of that was kind of, if not rejected, then kind of, I suppose, sort of sidetracked a bit. And it might be interesting to go back and look at what that could look like for all our young people. In terms of the triaging, I think it's really important to think about intersecting barriers as well, and not just consider neurodivergent young people as neurodivergent. So I have a wonderful daughter who is on the pathway and awaiting an autism assessment at the moment. But a potentially larger issue for her was that she was being bullied. But you can kind of blind yourself by focusing on one area of difficulty for young people, when in fact there could be multiple of them. You can have a young person who is being bullied and who has dyslexia, is autistic, and is also a young carer for mum at home. Just an example of a young person we have worked with. And you kind of need to address all of these things, and I think that's where the triaging has to come from. We need to think about everything being needs-based, not diagnosis-based. So that's where we would come from. And I would say, just to Lynn Binney's point around this sort of terminology around additional support needs is very wide, and I think we would welcome any discussion about what that looks like and how we can ensure that everybody who has additional support needs continue to be supported, or is supported better than they are now. I'd be very worried about any kind of tiered identification system within that, because I think you have some young people who are neurodivergent who cope with relatively little amount of support in school, and then you have some without a diagnosis who need much more support. So there's so many variables to consider within this. And then just a final thought to add, that at the moment as well, we know that more children are identified with additional support needs in areas where there's social deprivation, or who come from families who live in poverty. But that same cohort of children are less likely to access, for example, coordinated support plans. So the sort of more invasive, more holistic types of support tends to be more readily accessible by families who are able to shout the loudest for it, basically, who have the capacity, who are not preoccupied with clothing and feeding their children, where that's already taken care of, so they have the time and the energy for the fight. And I think a lot more needs to be done to think about the inequality in terms of the access to support.
Thanks, Marie. Angela, I'll bring you in, and then we'll move to questions from Rhoda.
To build on some of the points that Maura had raised, and to address the question around curriculum suitability, at Donaldson's we have huge success in alternative access to the curriculum, whether it's experiential learning, outdoor learning, skill-based alternatives. We find these approaches, they often reduce the sensory overload, they remove abstract instructions, they remove the need for sitting for long periods of time. And it allows our pupils to demonstrate their strengths and skills in a much more meaningful context for them. The independent review of qualifications and assessment does highlight the importance of transferable skills, but schools need staffing, they need professional development, they need time, they need facilities. We need that broader approach to assessment that moves beyond written exams. Our schools are experiencing, as you know, multiple reforms at the moment: curriculum assessment, inspection, national bodies. And alongside this, we have ASN complexity increasing, and I think that will directly shape how these curriculum and assessment reforms land in the classroom. We need to value well-being of our pupils alongside attainment. We need to value confidence, independence, life skills, regulation. Attainment is only a very small part of the story. Well-being is foundational. It's not secondary, it's not an add-on. At Donaldson's, it's our core educational purpose, and we have first-hand experience of when we get the well-being right, our learners feel safe and able to engage in the curriculum. If we want to get the curriculum right, we need to ask the people who are experiencing it. As neurodivergence becomes a central issue in education, not a marginal one, we need to be asking, hearing, representing the voices of our neurodivergent learners, so that reform is based on lived experience, not assumption. I think representation of these learners' views needs to be substantive, not symbolic. It needs to be legitimate and transparent. I think inclusive governance will give us a shot, if you like, at narrowing that policy practice gap. Yeah.
Thanks, Angela. Yeah.
Last point, and I know we need to move on. There was actually an item on BBC News this morning, I don't know if anybody's seen it, and it was talking about mainstreaming as against specialism, and that's a whole other debate in terms of that. But that was a really interesting article talking about that this morning. There was different perspectives saying about specialism and mainstreaming. So again, that's maybe something for the committee to talk about, but it's something I think it was really relevant. Thanks, Convener.
Thanks, Paul. Moving on now to questions from Rhoda Grant.
Thank you, Convener. And some of this has been discussed earlier, but Angela was talking about the adjustments that could be made, but hearing the rest of the panel, it doesn't seem that all schools make reasonable adjustments for neurodiverse people. So I wonder what in an ordinary school would be the norm for doing that? Is there changes of lighting, noise, flexibility of space use? What would be put in place normally for somebody who was neurodiverse?
Who wants to pick that up first? Lynn? Yeah.
All our schools make reasonable adjustments, and I'm very confident in that, Rhoda. There are a number of ways that they do that to meet the needs of the diverse learners that they have in place. Typically, we talk about universal practice, and that's practice that we would wish all our classrooms to have in place. They need to assess and understand their learners, and they need to be delivering the pace and challenge of the learning. And we call the word differentiation, all these terminology words, but the teacher is responsible for differentiating that learning for all the children and young people. Over and above that, schools as a unit have a number of supports in place. In the City of Edinburgh, where I am Head of Education, all our schools have access to support for learning teacher. There are a number of other specialist roles in our schools. We have PSOs for attendance, for example. We have nurture teachers, we have nurture rooms and classes. We have literacy support teachers, primary 7 transition teachers, who are all there to support children who need that more targeted and intensive level of support. And schools are very creative and adaptable at putting that support in place. We have a project that we're working with at the moment around spaces and how to reduce those sensory stimulation in our buildings. Buildings is a real challenge when it comes to meeting learners' needs. We have lots of work taking place in Edinburgh specifically that I'm aware of, but I know it's happening in other authorities, to look at softer spaces, regulation spaces, outdoor learning spaces to help support the regulation of our children and young people. And over and above that, local authorities do have a range of specialist intensive supports that can be put in place. Often they would include access to educational psychology service, access to school counselling service, therapeutic interventions that are funded specifically by the government to support children's mental health, and outreach teachers and teams, as well as a number of contracts with third sector speech and language therapy, and our grant-aided schools that Angela's here representing to be able to give us that more intensive specific advice. So there are a range of supports and resources that are in place. The question might be whether that's enough given the numbers and the diversity of learners that we now have in our system.
Thanks, Lynn. Hannah, I know you want to come in.
I was going to make the point about the learning estate, actually, that there's a vast amount of fantastic work being done by our teaching staff, but they will be doing it within the realities of the system and the properties that we have. So if you're working in an older building, for instance, and you're trying to, and they are very creative, there's a challenge in creating potentially the type of space that every neurodivergent learner might need. So you've got, I suppose, a range of different needs, potentially a range of different spaces. How do you do that in a way that works for everybody? There's massive pressures on capital funding. That's looking even more substantial, a significant amount of pressure in the coming year's budget. So I suppose it's being done, and it's being done well and creatively, but within a range of pressures.
Thanks, Hannah. Rhoda, did you want to come back in before I...
Yes, please. I just want to understand what advice and guidance schools would get, especially if a pupil hadn't had diagnosis. And I suppose the bottom line is, are we getting it right for every child? Is school meeting their needs?
Thanks, Rhoda. Jason, I'll bring you in on. And then Marie.
Can I think it's quite appropriate. Can I read this email? Is that okay? Yeah. So this is an email which I received on the 26th of January regarding my daughter, who is not able to attend school for about a year now. She did have a degree of reasonable adjustments in place, and what happened to her was that on one occasion a classroom teacher decided not to grant that. So she had an early pass out of the class at 5 minutes to the end of the thingy of the period, so that she could move without being involved in the sensory crush, and that wasn't allowed. And we spoke to the school and said, look, can you just remind that member of staff, maybe they haven't realised, maybe they didn't know what was happening, and we were told that that was done, and the very next period of the same teacher, they did exactly the same thing again, and that caused Gracie to, she couldn't trust anybody after that. So that's the background of why she can't actually get into school, because she's essentially terrified. She vomits in the morning if she has to go. She's her. And school did offer us. I think I said earlier, just briefly, about we have to be careful that we're not trying to get neurodivergent children to tolerate the intolerable. And there's an issue, for example, with school psychology. So we were offered school counselling, but what would school counselling do without the system? What would we be doing then? So that was our worry as a parent. Anyway, I just wanted to read you this as an example of our experience, at least. So, dear parent carer, I wanted to take this opportunity to reflect on Gracie's progress during the first session of school year as part of our commitment to celebrating the successes of the vast majority of pupils who come to school each day ready to learn and engage well in Calderglen High School. We will be offering pupils the opportunity to attend our Celebrating Success trip to Blackpool. Pupils who have consistently demonstrated our school values of, and I note they're in bold, achievement, ambition, determination, inclusion, respect and responsibility, all of which I think are laudable, and met our key expectations of attend, behave and care, will be invited to attend. In practice, this means the following: a pupil's attendance being above 90%, a pupil being late no more than 5 times, a pupil receiving no more than 5 demerits or referrals for their behaviour. Unfortunately, Gracie is not currently meeting this standard. Please find an update of their attendance, late coming and demerits referrals for the period up until the Christmas holidays below. Attendance rate for session 25 to 26, August to December only, 47.19%, which is probably a gross overestimation in fairness. Number of lates, 21. Number of demerits referrals, 0. We appreciate that there may be some individual circumstances that will have had an impact, and where we have been made aware of these, this has been taken into consideration. We are committed to supporting Gracie to achieve success during their time at Calderglen, and if they are able to show improvement, work harder, over the period until Friday the 27th of February, we would be delighted for them to attend this Celebrating Success trip. I will email an update following the Easter holidays to inform you of Gracie's success with regards to this. Now, the legal advice that I have received is that that email is contradictory to the Equalities Act. It's an illegal email, essentially. It's discriminatory, is the legal advice that I've had. But that is sent centrally from a school in a local authority, which presumably has been signed off at a certain level by somebody senior. And I guess the reason I'm reading that out to you is because that's my personal experience. So we can talk about numbers, and as I said before, I'm wearing 2 hats. There's our personal experience. So there's my daughter told, you're not good enough to come on the trip. You've not worked hard enough. You've not done enough. You've not met the standards that this school expects of you. You've not, you're not worthy, right? That's the message she got, and we had 2 days of her sobbing, and there's nothing wrong with me, I'm fine, there's nothing wrong with me, but tears running down her cheeks when she eventually said, why can't I just be like the other girls? What's wrong with me? Yeah. Now, as dad, I've got a problem there, especially as an autistic dad. I've got a problem because there's nothing wrong with you. When you're not in school, you're fine. What is wrong is this system is wrong, right? That's what's. It's nothing to do with you. You're not broken, defective in any way, shape or form. You just happen to be autistic, and that's fine. But it's an uphill battle to preserve that. Now, now, I've already complained about a version of that email a year before, right? And we did it informally. So in words to who's taken things to tribunal, that's going to tribunal now, because that's the second time. So we've tried to settle it informally. We've tried, we've worked, we've had so many meetings about can you do this, can you do that? And unfortunately, it always falls through. And from a personal experience, the reason it falls through is lack of communication within the school. It's really difficult. I get it. They've got 2,700 kids. How do you track 2,700 separate adjustment needs, right? How do you do that? How do you remember who's got what? Blah, blah, blah. So there's systemic problems. I get that completely. There's a fundamental lack of understanding what neurodivergence is. And that's not teachers' fault either, because they're not trained in it. They don't get that experience. They don't get any form of, 4 hours, I think, in the standard undergraduate degree, of what it's like to be neurodivergent, and that's informed from a deficit paradigm. So I hope that's kind of, I just wanted to bring that because I thought it's really important that that is what we neurodivergent parents, neurodivergent young people are dealing with in a system that predominantly shouldn't do that, that has laws, and we have systems that make that completely inappropriate, yet there it is in black and white.
Thanks for sharing that, Jason. Rhoda, do you want to come back in? Marie in the room wants to come in as well, but do you want to come in on that, Rhoda?
I mean, that sounds terrible, and it kind of suggests that not every school is getting the right training, advice and guidance on how they approach children who are neurodiverse. And I wonder if those that are providing that advice and guidance are able to comment on how they can make sure that happens.
Thanks, Rhoda. I know Marie wants to come in, and Jared as well, and then Angela. Yes.
Thank you so much. So I think, Rhoda, part of the issue is that this is so individual, not just to local authorities, but down to the sort of culture in particular schools. So all of these things are addressed in very different ways. So we work with some children and young people who have been referred through the justice system or through to the children's hearing system very quickly after stopping attending school. And similar cases in other local authorities never are, so there can be quite far-reaching ramifications, for example, for non-attendance based on where you are. And the next point to address, I think, is about reasonable adjustments. What does that actually mean? What is considered reasonable? It's quite interpretive, I suppose, what a reasonable adjustment is, and quite often parents will have one idea, schools will have another idea, and trust you me, the children will have their very own idea of what's reasonable for them, and we need to really listen to them and put them at the absolute centre of these discussions about what can support them. And then we need to think about when we put these adjustments in place, or when schools put them in place, who are they actually for? So a wonderful member of my team who works directly with children and young people has been out working with a lot of children who sit alone, isolated in classrooms away from their peers. And she's saying there could just as well be a brick wall instead of a door, you know, because they become so segregated within the school community. They feel bored, they feel stupid, they feel that they don't belong. But that is considered a reasonable adjustment for that particular young person. We have from the Inquire staff team, they gave me some examples as well of support being put in place but then being removed once things improve, which I think can be quite detrimental as well to sort of get the young person to a point where they actually feel they're achieving, and at that point the consensus is, well, now things are working, so we can now reduce that level of support, which then sort of causes another crash. There was an example of a young person who received one-to-one support at lunchtime and break time. When that was removed, then it led to police involvement because the young person completely fell through the cracks and was completely unable to cope. We have examples of families who are struggling struggling financially and emotionally because the children can only access an education 1.5 hours a day. And in one case, the parent was told, your child can come in for an hour and a half a day, but you need to be available to us. So that parent is now unable to hold down a job, and that's a single parent as well. So we have endless lists of situations like this, and I cannot stress enough that local authorities are doing what they can for the far most of the time. Teachers are doing as much as they can, but the whole environment feels, again, it's back to my point, about the gap between what we should be offering and what we're able to offer. And I think my main point would just be around don't remove the support once it's in place. If things are working, that's a good thing. One of our young advisors called Nova, so she's a wonderful neurodivergent young person, and she told me how she was in a situation where she was unable to attend school. So her I suppose her emotional well-being was more important than her attending at that point in time. When she slowly started reintegrating into the school environment, there was a plan drawn up and reasonable adjustments were made, and she was told the support would be available to her. When she found herself at crisis point and went to the hub where she was told she could access support, she was turned away and told to come back an hour and a half later because that was her scheduled slot for support. Now, young people's emotional distress does not follow a schedule, so the reasonable adjustment that was put in place was in effect the paper exercise, and this young person who needed to access support was told to go away and come back later. So we need to sort of think carefully about what reasonable adjustments mean and who they're working for. Are they working for the individual young person? Has that young person said, yes, this is what I need? Or have they sort of come into existence because something needs to be on paper? But is it actually doing what it sets out to do?
Thanks, Marie. I know Jared wants to come in.
Hello. I just want to pick up on a point that Jason made about the 4 hours training for teachers. Now, I'm a secondary trained school teacher. I work in a special school in Edinburgh. Now, that's the training I've had as well. I would say probably the difference for myself is I have an actual autism diagnosis myself. Now, so I've got lived experience. The whole reason I wanted to become a teacher was to give other learners the education that I did not have when I went to school. And I left school nearly 40 years ago now, and sometimes I feel we've not moved with the times. Now, I think that Scotland needs a long-term resourcing strategy. We need action to reduce class sizes and significantly enhance the availability of specialist ASN and support and expertise within our schools. Now, the reality for teachers is that in a typical class size in a mainstream school of 33, more than 14 children will have additional support need of some sort. Some who may have a dual diagnosis, and they will all vary in terms of complexity. Now, 4 hours training, does that cover that? But this is a 7-fold increase since 2007. And investment in education has not kept pace with the rising level of need. And the number of specialist ASN teachers in Scotland has fallen by 20% over that same period. And that removes a valuable source of specialist support and advice from classroom teachers. But the consequences of that, those are what are far-reaching, those are what are very profound. So for young people, it means that far too many are not having their individual needs adequately met in the classroom, despite the best efforts of teachers. And for teachers, the results, excessive workload, increases in stress and stress-related illnesses as they struggle to deal with the diverse demands that are placed upon them. And then lastly, for society, it means a growing number of people, young people, becoming frustrated and disengaged from education with serious long-term consequences for all concerned. That's all I've really got to say on that point.
Thank you, Jared. Marie McNair's indicated she wants to come in on that point.
Yeah,
so over to you,
come
Marie.
on that. Obviously, Gerard, is it your belief then that the teacher training should be led by, with folk who have autism and ADHD. Certainly lived experience panel that I was at last night, they were of that view that the training must come from folk who've got lived experience. You were saying there 4-hour training, is that like sort of yearly? I mean, what is your experience there?
Well, basically, if I can come on in that, I mean, as for training being autism-led, I can see the benefits of that. I can't see that it's always going to work. But it certainly, I know that myself being in education, I work in a special school in Edinburgh for learners with a diagnosis of autism. And as myself as a teacher, I've got a unique insight. We're basically on the same wavelength. We're on the same radio channel all the time. We know how to work together. Now, thankfully, I've got that. If that wasn't for that lived experience I've got, I would find that probably the training that I would get, it would have to be self-led by myself. Now, we can get training within inset sessions and so on as teachers which help us with this. But if you were to go to a teacher training college, the actual training that you get on additional support needs is very minimal. It's basically you're learning on the job. Essentially, yeah. I don't know if that's answered your question, but
no,
it's certainly something he's looking at.
It's helpful, and I can certainly put it out to the room as well if anybody else wants to kind of share their view. So, Maura and Marie, want to come in?
Yeah, I was going to say, whilst it would be really valuable to have lived experience, and we do have psychologists who have an identification of neurodivergence. What we tend to do, as I previously mentioned, is we use the materials of NATE, who connect with people who have lived experience. So we are using those materials that have been kind of ratified by groups of young people and autistic adults. And that's the training looks at transition for young people into P1. So that initial experience of school, and then there's wider training about any transitions, and then looking specifically at secondary training as well. And it's also about, it's neuroaffirming, and I think, as I mentioned before, it's also about trying to change attitudes. So it's not that kind of deficit-driven model, it's just looking at what's the profile of need and how do we support that.
Thank you. Marie?
I'll be very quick. I absolutely think lived experience is a fantastic place to start, especially that of children and young people. None of us here know what it's like to be a neurodivergent young person today. None of us have had to go through COVID and all the added pressures with social media, screen time, all of these things that young people are trying to navigate today. So I think training has to start with people who actually genuinely know what they're talking about because they're living it. Another thing that was pointed out to me by a member of my staff team who works very closely with a specialist school in Edinburgh, we're developing training on complex needs for hopefully all of Scotland one day. And one of the things she pointed out, the staff had told her that it's actually not possible as part of your teacher training to get a placement in a specialist setting. Now, I think specialist settings are hubs of knowledge, and there's so much good practice, there's so much good stuff happening in these settings that could be transferable and could be pulled out of that context and into mainstream settings, but there has to be, you know, an avenue for that. There has to be a way for prospective teachers to go in and access that knowledge. And then finally, just want to bang the drum for our My Rights, My Say Young Advisors, for the inclusion ambassadors, both groups of young people who sit within Children in Scotland and are working really, really hard to provide advice and information based on their lived experience to people around them. So look them up or get in touch, because they're phenomenal and very, very mighty, very feisty, and they will tell you everything you want to hear and a lot of things you maybe don't want to hear. So
I think it's got to sit with the individual school as well. If they've identified a need, you know, they should be providing the training through maybe in-service days or whatever, you know. So, Jason, you wanted to come in?
No, just to that point, the figure that the figure that Gerard quoted that I'd said was from the undergraduate curriculum from the University of Glasgow, just to be precise. So it was 4 hours, but it's 4 hours of inclusive training, so that includes everything. Some of the findings from this were that, as you said, training is sometimes brought in by individual schools, but there is an issue with quality assurance of that. So there's no kind of, kite mark standard, something like that schools could say, well, they've got this accreditation or that accreditation, we should use this provider or not. So that's a bit of an issue. So quality might fluctuate. The other thing is, I think young people's experiences are really important, and we've given some thought in this to how we can do that in a safe way, because obviously it's only some young people that are able to front up and talk like that, but there's also now other ways in which we can do that. We can animate voices, and Nate have done that very effectively. So they've animated young person's voice so they don't have to appear on camera or on a film, but their points can be made appropriately. And the only other thing about about lived experience, while it's absolutely vital because it can't be, I guess from the autism community, it can be a little bit like, you feel a bit like the guinea pig in the people talk about you and tell you what you are, what you're supposed to be. And that's one of the reasons for saying, well, actually, it really needs to be somebody who has lived this, somebody who has walked in those shoes. The danger is anecdote, n equals 1. So again, there's a risk of, that's my experience, therefore it's everybody's experience. And there's quite famous autistic advocates that sometimes even fall into that trap. And so when we're designing or thinking about that kind of curriculum for teachers, I think we have to be very careful to make sure that it's broad and representative and doesn't just get the noisy voices, gets the quiet voices as well. But there are ways in which that can be done with a bit of thought.
Who else would benefit then from training that, folk working with children? Do you think there should be like awareness training, carried out in schools as well for everyone that works in the school?
So we had so within this, what we had proposed as our kind of framework, there was 4 levels to that. One is policy, which I've kind of done today. The ones that are more attainable were culture change driven by lived experience, people understanding, shift away from deficit, understanding what it's really like to be a kid. Because I think if we really understood what it was like to be a neurodivergent child, that email would never have been written. Yeah, right? Absolutely. There's no... I get the intent of that email. I understand what it's about. Right? It's about meeting targets of attendance. Right? You wouldn't have written it if you'd been sitting, and I would never have written that, right? Because I would have seen what that would have done. And you can't know what you don't know. So for me, that would be the benefit. We've talked very clearly about whole school community. So it's not just teachers. We've talked about teachers here, but that's not the whole school. There's the school leadership, there's the teachers, there's the janitors, there's the facilities, the catering staff, the administration staff. It's all of that in terms of culture. And there's the parents and how we... And the kids, how do the kids get their voice across? How do they understand? So we talked about that. The other thing that we're interested in, and to Gerard's point about, teachers are incredibly stressed, and it's really difficult to come from a mentalising point of view when you're super stressed. Stress deliberately narrows your view. That's why we have anxiety. That's why, we become very acutely aware of just one point. And so we're thinking about teachers are also the only staff group working full-time with children who don't have psychologically informed reflective practice space, for example. Why not? So, would that be something that's helpful? That's something that we want to investigate. So that was the kind of the 4 levels, if you like, of our of what we thought was a potential solution to this problem in the long term.
Thanks. Anybody else want to come in?
Yes, so I've got Angela and then Hannah.
Just to pick up on a couple of points that have already been raised, I agree with Marie that there needs to be a clearer definition of reasonable adjustments. And I also think reasonable adjustments need to be reframed through the lens of access and not advantage. To go back to Lynn and Hannah's point on the physical environment, my experience has been that our children at Donaldson's, one of their barriers hasn't really been the curriculum, but it's been the environment in which they were trying to learn in. Now, I agree with Lynn, teachers are amazingly creative and they will do absolutely everything to meet the needs of learners in their classroom. But overwhelming and unpredictable environments does increase anxiety and stress for neurodivergent learners. And it does lead to reduced attendance. I think an area for development is building standard. I think future buildings, they need to be neuroaffirming, they need to be sensory aware, they need to consider the lighting, the acoustics, the visual cam, the flexible use of spaces. At Donaldson's, we follow the National Autistic Society's spell framework. Our environment is wholly low arousal. And again, this touches on what Lynn had said around universal access. If we get that right, that impacts all of our learners, not just those who are neurodivergent, and it reduces reliance on reactive adjustments. In terms of training, I think teachers need far more than a one-off training session. It needs to be sustained. They need to have time, they need to have access to specialists, because without that, you do what you know, or you do your best with what you've got. And I think without that sustained professional development, schools are more likely to rely on exclusionary practices to meet unmet need or to cope with system pressures.
Thanks, Angela. Hannah.
I've got a number of points, if it's okay. I think, sort of thinking about teacher training, which has come up a couple of times, I think I'm looking at my education colleagues, I think would you get 35 hours of CPD a year? There's a lot of demand on that time. And I think it's making sure that the training that meets the need both of the job and the individual. And I think so when we're thinking about what training looks like, that we need to keep that in mind. There was a question about how we make sure that information on and training and resources gets out to schools and teachers. I mentioned the review of the implementation of the neurodevelopmental specification earlier. One of the things that is being looked at there is what resources are available, and we've had some discussion around resources from NATE and NES and how we might disseminate those resources further. So I think some of those discussions are afoot. I think there was an interesting point made about attendance, and I was thinking about actually sort of the wider policy coherence that we need to be thinking about in relation to this. There's obviously a big drive around attendance post-COVID, making sure that our children are getting the most out of our education settings. And as we're looking at those different pieces of policy, I think at all levels we need to be thinking about what does that mean from a neurodevelopmental perspective. Those are things that we should be taking account and looking forward. I'm thinking about things like reduced class contact time and maintenance of teacher numbers. We need to be fully taking into account what the potential impacts are on our children with additional support needs, including the sort of children and young people that we're talking about today. So I think those are points ticked off from the previous.
Thanks very much, Hannah. I'm going to move to questions from Pam now. Thanks, Pam.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, everybody, for the information you've provided so far. Education is key to helping children develop the skills they will need later in life to become responsible adults. Obviously, autistic children face additional barriers, which we've heard a lot about today, including social difficulties, sensory overload and academic struggles and obstacles. And of course, many times these children are often bullied and excluded by their peers. So what can we do to ensure autistic and other neurodivergent children are given an equal opportunity in life? So I want to focus that there's obviously a lot being said in relation to the difficulties, but I think I want to focus on this question more on the bully side and the excluding by the peers.
Who wants to come in? Jason, go for it. Sorry.
Thank you. That's a really insightful question, because I think we do spend a lot of time thinking about all the bad stuff and we don't think about how do we actually maximise the good stuff. So I mentioned previously about a comparison with LGBTQI as being a kind of example of a... So I think I can build a very good case to say that neurodivergent people in general, neurodivergent children and young people are amongst the most discriminated against group of individuals in this country, and it's still at that level where it's insidious, not called out, not noted, there's not really a legal framework around it. So while we still have massive problems with discrimination on ethnic grounds and massive problems in discrimination on gender and sexuality, there are frameworks in place that have perhaps reduced that. I'm not an expert as to whether that's actually the lived experience, but at least there has been some societal shift that has allowed more parity for other minority groups. That remains conspicuously absent for neurodivergent people. So I think my short answer, I'm aware that I can ramble, so I'll just try and be short and brief about this. The short answer is that it's culture change. It's nationally understanding that neurodivergence is not a bad thing, that autism spectrum disorder is a misnomer, that ADHD is a misnomer, that we would expect there to be variations and people can be different and it's okay. So there has to be work on that. We have to get away from this deficit, there's something wrong with you, you're a problem. And we need to move to affirming approaches where neurodivergent children can celebrate their identity. I mean, from an economic point of view, they're a massive loss, you know, and maybe even in this time, in these troubling times, maybe neurodivergent people show what the point of them is in the population. Do you know, like so all populations survive by diversity. If we were all exactly the same, we were all clones, then we would not survive. We need that diversity. It's designed in. It's you know, it's in the population. It's meant to be in the population. What do neurodivergent kids actually bring? Rather than saying academic difficulties, let's just say we don't always learn typically. There's no association with autism and a learning problem. There's an association with, there's a common overlap with, or a relatively common overlap with autism and learning disability, and they're kind of two separate things that happen to exist in the same person. But just an autistic person, if you like, if such a person exists, doesn't actually have a problem with learning. They have a problem with engaging with a system that's not designed to help them learn. So reframing stuff across into that social aspect, I think, is really important. And, you know, what do autistic people, you know, let's just take autism. What are autistic people good at? We're good at pattern recognition. We're good at seeing things from a different perspective. We're good at understanding situations that other people get stuck in you know, the social mould, if you like. We're not in the social mould, so we don't get stuck in that. This is what's expected of you. What do ADHD people bring? They bring spontaneity, they bring creativity, they bring risk, an appetite for risk. All of these things are super vital in appropriate numbers within economic spheres, within businesses. You know, some Silicon Valley companies are actively recruiting neurodivergent people for that very purpose, because we're stagnating here. We need to have different points of view, different skill sets. You know, if you're autistic, you'd be an excellent police officer, generally speaking, right? Eye for detail, sense of, you know, right and wrong, what is and isn't. What, you know, those are the kind of things that we need to be thinking about. What are the niches? What are the positive niches where neurodivergent people fit, where they do well? What's the point in neurodivergent people in society? What do they do? And maximising that, along with reducing the stigma, because the stigma is huge. I'm the only out neurodivergent or autistic child and adolescent psychiatrist in Scotland. Now, that's within psychiatry, right? where we have policies that say, oh, we don't stigmatise, right? But we absolutely stigmatise, because I know colleagues who are almost certainly autistic, and they would be far too scared to say, in case it affected their job. They weren't allowed to be employed anymore. How can you be autistic and be a psychiatrist? How can you so all of that stigma, all of that rubbish permeates throughout, and that's the kind of thing societally we need to get rid of. And I think it needs to be it's a broad church of approaches that has to happen to allow that to allow neurodivergent people to actually integrate and flourish. Because at the moment they're actively set aside for all the reasons we've discussed this morning.
Thanks, Jason. Hannah, did you want to come in?
I'm probably unhelpfully going to answer a question with a question, but I wonder if some of the sort of rise in demand for diagnosis is us beginning to see the start of that cultural shift, that perhaps we're seeing self-stigma coming down and people being more comfortable about coming forward and saying, like, I need support with this, or how, what does this mean for me, I suppose. So, and I wonder if our children and young people in our primary school settings would have quite the same reflections and experiences as our children and young people who are perhaps in late high school or have moved on. So I think we maybe need to question where we are at the moment, actually, in terms of what our younger children in particular might be experiencing. I think there's something about the communication again that we're putting out into the public sphere around neurodevelopment. I know when we did the review, we saw quite a lot come through around social media, and that was potentially driving some of the ask around diagnosis and assessment, that children and young people were recognising themselves in social media, and that has a real positive in terms of the awareness raising and making sure people get the support that they need. There's also, I think, a responsibility that we need to think about around the misinformation that is out there and the potential negatives that might bring if we're thinking about the way that children and young people communicate with each other.
Thanks. Angela, you want to come in, and then I'll come back to you, Pam.
Just very quickly, I think at a classroom level, if we want to shift barriers, attitudes, we need to have a rights-based approach that moves the focus from the child to the environment and the system that they are sitting in. In my opinion, the barriers are systemic, they are structural, they're not individual. Children with ASN are 5 times more likely to be excluded from school. So to me, that suggests a structural inequity and not an individual or family issue.
Sorry, Pam. Before I bring you back in, Marie wanted to come in on that point.
I'll try to be quick again. I think we're talking about 43% of children with additional support needs and 10 to 20% of the population who are neurodivergent in one way or another. We're not talking about a tiny add-on here. You know, they are big. Children with additional support needs are a vibrant part of our school and our society. And I think it starts with that culture change that Jason has talked about as well, that we need to consider not educating them and the others, but educating everybody and finding an education system that works for every individual child. And a neurotypical child is not going to suffer because we put things in place to support neurodivergent children and young people. No one is going to come to harm from us becoming more flexible, for us thinking about the sensory overload, the social interaction, all of those things. And I think what Jason said as well about celebrating all of these wonderful skills that neurodivergent children and young people have, we're dropping them on the floor at the moment. My daughter read 5 really large novels in January alone. So she's written 1,800 pages and she's 9 years old. And this is a wonderful, wonderful thing. But a part of her think that potentially something about her is not right. She is right. She's exactly who she needs to be. She's exactly who she's meant to be. And this needs to be celebrated. I mean, that's a massive skill to have. I couldn't read 4 novels if you paid me to do it. So we need to celebrate this, and we need to teach children to celebrate the unique differences and varied abilities and skills that our young people have. I will die on the hill that the presumption of mainstream is a good thing. I think it's really healthy and good for our children and young people to be together, learn from each other, but it needs to be resourced properly. The environment needs to be appropriate so children and young people don't go in with a feeling that I have to wait to fail so I can access the support I need in order to thrive. And that's what it feels like. Parents tell us time and time again that they feel like they're fighting, they're using this militant language to describe how they feel, their relationship with schools, or it's fighting, battling, combat. You know, it's all of these very, very negative connotations. So we need to build those relationships for the children and their relationships with the schools, for the parents and carers and children and their peers, and celebrate diversity rather than be frightened of it.
Thanks, Marie. Pam, back to you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for your answers there. We've heard that there is inconsistent support for neurodivergent pupils across Scotland, leading to a postcode lottery. For example, you know, why should an autistic child living in East Dunbartonshire and a child living in the Highlands not be receiving the same level of support? So I wanted to ask, what steps do you think that believe that should be taken to address this?
Marie, no, sorry, I thought there was an invitation.
Lynn? I don't disagree with that, Pam, and that's the nature of the system in which we work. we have local authorities. Local authorities determine resources and they determine how those resources are deployed into schools, which can impact on the different types of interventions that are available for children and young people to access. Head teachers in our schools also have a decision around how they allocate resource, and we see increasing need, and I pick up on a point that Mary made earlier. We see increasing need in areas of deprivation, and the head teachers have to decide how they allocate their resource in their school to prioritise the children with the greatest need. And that is a reality of the system that we're in. And it does impact on the definition of what a reasonable adjustment is. Reasonable adjustments have to take into account the resource that is available. And that is the system that we currently in Scotland operate with regards to how resources are allocated Scottish Government into local authority and local authority into school. And that would be for not for ADES or head teachers to determine if there were to be changes to that system. But that is in large why it leads to there being differences in resources available for children and young people with additional support needs.
Thanks, Lynn. Hannah, you want to come
I suppose just adding to that, beyond education, what resources are available vary quite significantly across the country, and that might be what additional family support there is within the third sector, or what health is able to support, what support health offers around ND. So I think there is that sort of variability that you then have to think about within a school setting and how you would interact with that. We talk quite often about sort of consistent outcomes rather than consistent approaches, recognising that in some areas you might not be able to totally replicate what you can do, but you can support the person to achieve the best outcome regardless of that, and try and make the best use of the resources that you have available. Sort of city versus Highland and Island settings, for instance, you might have to take a different approach to the support you put in place because of the realities of the rurality, for instance, or the staffing that you might have in that particular area. So I think that sort of trying to support consistent achievement of outcomes is an important point to take into account.
Thanks, Hannah. Angela, do you want to come in on that?
I think, to answer your question, Pam, I think we need some national direction in terms of shared understanding in data investment. I think we need some thought into provision and access so that resources are equitably shared across local authorities. I think we need to consider workforce capacity so that we've got increased and protected investment for our schools. And I also think we just need to lift the lid on the system pressure a little bit and have that whole system capacity building to build that consistency across local authorities.
Thanks, Angela. Pam, do you have anything else to add?
No, thank you, Chair. Thank you, everybody, for your responses.
Thanks, folks. That brings us to the end of our questions. I know we've covered an awful lot of ground this morning, and we've run a wee bit over, so thank you for your patience. But I wonder, is there anything that any of our members wanted to get down on the record? Any of our witnesses want to make sure they said today? Just give you the last opportunity.
If I could just quote one of my parents who said they want their child to thrive in school, not survive. And I think that's what we need to aim for.
Okay. Thanks, Angela. Anyone else? Any last words? No. Well, can I thank you all very much? As I say, you've given us really, really rich information there for us to consider. Thank you for your time. We will now suspend briefly while we change over our panels and give people a wee bit of a break. But thank you again for coming in this morning. Really appreciate it. And thank you, Jared, online. Much appreciated. Welcome back, everyone, and thank you for your patience. We'll now move to our second roundtable this morning, which will focus on the workplace. Before we move to questions from members, I'd like to invite everyone to introduce themselves. I'll begin and we'll move round the table from my right. So I'm Maggie Chapman, I'm Deputy Convener of the Equalities, Human Rights and Civil Justice Committee, and I'm Scottish Green MSP for North East Scotland region.
Hi, I'm Fergus McMillan, Head of Equality and Diversity at Skills Development Scotland across our service delivery. So that includes the Careers Service, the Modern Apprenticeship Programme, Foundation Apprenticeships, and our work with employers and skills planning.
Marie McNair, an MSP representing a constituency MSP representing Clydebank and Mulgai constituency. Prior to that, a councillor for 19 years in West Dumbartonshire.
Thanks, Marie.
Hi, I'm Jill McAlpine. I am a business owner, an employer here representing the FSB. I also have an ADHD brain and I'm a perimenopausal woman, so I've got lots to say on the subject.
Thanks, Jill. It's over to you.
Hi, I'm David Cameron from the Scottish Union of Supported Employment, and we're the national representative body for organisations that support disabled people into paid work.
Thanks, David.
Hi, I'm Mia Preston. I'm a teacher, retired foster carer and now a neurodivergent mentor, and I'm representing the FSB.
Thanks, Mia.
Good morning, I'm Alan Thornburn, I'm the Chief Executive of Salveson Mindroom Centre. We're a national neurodiversity charity supporting children, young people, pertinent to the previous session, but also advising businesses on widening access and supporting progression through the workplace for neurodivergent individuals.
Thanks, Alan.
I'm Paul McLennan. I'm the MSP for East Lothian, and like Marie, prior to that, I was 15 years a councillor in East Lothian.
Thanks, Paul.
Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Marek Zemanik. I am the Senior Public Policy Advisor for the UK Nations at the CIPD, with a professional body for HR and people development.
Thanks, and we'll go to people online, and Kirsty. Sorry, Kirsty, we're just waiting for your mic.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
We can, yes, carry on.
Okay. Hi, I'm Kirsty McFadden. I'm an economist at the Fraser Valander Institute at Strathclyde University, and I have been leading our learning disabilities employment research over the last couple of years, which has now expanded to include neurodivergence as well.
Thanks, Kirsty. And Rhoda?
Hi, I'm Rhoda Grant. I'm Scottish Labour MSP for the Highlands and Islands region.
Thanks, Rhoda. And Pam?
My name's Pam Gosso. I'm a Scottish Conservative regional MSP for the West of Scotland.
Thanks, Pam. Thank you all, and you're all very welcome. Really appreciate you attending this morning. We'll now move to questions from members, and Pam, I'll start with you. So over to you, Pam.
Thank you, Chair. Employment is the best solution to poverty, yet only 29% of autistic people are employed compared to more than 80% of the general public. Unfortunately, many employers do not have sufficient understanding of what it means to be neurodivergent, leading to poor workplace experiences and discrimination for neurodivergent staff. So, what should employers be doing, not just encourage autistic people to join the workforce, but also to remain in the workforce?
Thanks, Pam. Mia, I see you. Carry on.
Hi. Interestingly, I've been doing some research into what some of the big companies like Microsoft and Ernst Young. And what's really interesting, they start with the recruitment process because a lot of times that gets in the way of neurodivergent people accessing work. They have a dedicated team who are with them all the way through the process and then stay with them once they're employed. They have transparency. It's about communication and language, not just for the person who could be employed, but for the people who are on the other side who are doing the employment as well. It's really simplified. There's accommodations as well are clearly communicated to both sides. There's training for the staff who are going to be on board, and they don't rely on social interviews. So they're looking at shadowing, they're looking at how they're interviewing so that they get a general idea. But it really starts, in my experience, trying to recognise why neurodivergent people are a real benefit to the companies. Once you start with that, then the willingness to make those changes to their interview processes, to their onboarding, then becomes something that everybody's invested in.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Mia. Yes, David.
I think we need to do a lot of education for employers to understand the diverse range of talents that exist, and if you're not open to all, you know, in the community and society, you're actually missing out on a lot. And employers need to build their capacity, and I emphasise the point they need to build their capacity. I don't think it's the taxpayer's job to do it for them, to be honest, particularly for private businesses. They need to test what they do, and they need to consult with neurodivergent people. So the example of recruitment, they will have, I expect, have discovered that different processes by talking to people and finding out what was working for them, and particularly what wasn't working for them. An example that we've done that's kind of similar is, I actually spoke about this last time I was at this group, at this committee, was about digital recruitment that a lot of employers do nowadays. Everything's online. All recruitment's pretty much online nowadays. And we do an exercise with employers where a group of disabled people test the system for a real job application, and they find out where all the barriers and the bugs are and the things that stop them completing an application. They provide the employer with a report and an action plan to take forward. But the thing that's remarkable about it is people make these kind of changes in the workplace, for example, moving their recruitment online, and they never test it. Mm-hmm. They never check with disabled people or neurodivergent people, does this actually work? And the great thing that you can do as well is when people have come through the recruitment process, for example, go back and actually have those conversations as to the things that worked for you and why did that person choose this job as well. Because it's not just with the employer making a choice, the person's making a choice to go and work for that organisation. What was it that organisation is doing right, and what can be taken to other organisations as well.
Jill, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I actually, for my day job, advise businesses on business growth. And so I like to look at it from the other part of, actually, as you have already said, that neurodivergence can unlock so much more divergence of thought. But actually putting inclusion at the heart of performance, we see time and time again that works. So the Google Aristotle project found the #1 driver of high performance in teams is psychological safety. And then we know that there's well-cited research from Amy Edmondson at Harvard that says uncertainty and friction are the biggest hidden cost to businesses. So if we look at it with a business head on, it makes more sense for us to create the conditions and focus on creating the conditions to have a high-performance team. And because if you have those three elements existing in your workplace, then it's going to be a lot more comfortable for somebody who's autistic or somebody like me who's ADHD, because most people don't want to have that conversation with you. So create psychological safety in your workplace, make sure that you reduce friction and uncertainty. Let people know what the rules are, the unwritten rules, and the conversation flips. Thank you.
Thanks, Jill. Alan, you wanted to come in, and then Mary.
Thank you. So I'll build on that, actually. So psychological safety is one of the key pillars in terms of disclosure around neurodivergence, and that isn't a goal. It doesn't mean to say that everybody should have to share, how they are wired and how they process and experience the world, but it does help in many respects. The population occurrence we know well, between 10 and 20%. Disclosure in the workplace, in our experience, is anemic. It is under 5%. And that's driven by a few things. It's stigma, but there is also fear and discrimination under that. And there's, multiple evidence from CIPD, among others, that will speak to that as well. We've done a lot of work with neurodivergent employees and, their employers on what would work or what could have been better when you moved into the workplace and you tried to progress through it. Psychological safety was a key one. Leadership and storytelling at a leadership level is critical as well, and that's not uncommon around affecting cultural change. And then it being something that the whole culture of an organisation owns. And the basic principles we've seen, yes, recruitment, but actually going further back, it's educating. People aren't, excluding neurodivergent people from a place of ill will. It's from a place of lack of understanding, we tend to find. So the more you can educate and upskill and make neurodiversity everybody's business, the better. And that does lead to, better conversations. It leads to, generally speaking, greater disclosure, and then hopefully more enlightened approaches to all the things that Jill's just talked about: productivity, business growth, creativity, and much more beyond.
Thanks, Alan. Marek.
I have to agree with just about everything that has been said so far. I just thought I would add a little bit more evidence to some of it. On the business benefit front, we did a big report back in 2024 called Neuro Inclusion at Work, which was based on an employer survey, but also an employee survey. And that report shows very, very clearly that those employers who invest additional resources and put more effort into neuro inclusion then report very clear, both individual but also organizational positive outcomes. On the individual front, individual employee well-being, but also employee performance. And on the organizational front, much better retention, but also recruitment opportunities from a wider talent pool. So there is evidence there that shows that there's business outcomes linked to supporting neurodivergence and neuro-inclusion in organizations. Now, how you do that? To answer the question directly, yes, it starts at the recruitment stage, of course, making sure that job descriptions, for example, are nice and clear, short, that they make clear, for example, that you are willing to discuss and offer reasonable adjustments. That has to be made very, very clear straight up front. Then, of course, providing those reasonable adjustments, which can range from a lot of different things. For example, providing interview questions in advance as well, giving more time for written tasks, etc., etc. So that's the recruitment stage. And, of course, there's the in-work support, ongoing in-work support. Again, reasonable adjustments is part of that. But quite a few people already mentioned organizational culture. That is a huge, huge part of this as well. Organizational culture linked to senior leadership as well has a real role to play. Psychological safety, as Jill mentioned, is extremely important for neurodivergent individuals. One thing that has perhaps not been mentioned quite as explicitly, we maybe will come to that throughout the session, is people management and people management capability and capacity as well. So that's linked to the education piece as well, making sure managers understand what neurodiversity is, making sure they are comfortable having a very clear human-centric approach to people management, that they speak to employees as well. That is absolutely key and crucial.
Thanks, Marek. And yes, Fergus, you wanted to come in as well.
Thanks, Convener. I mean, I would also echo a lot of what's been said so far. We also work with employers, and in terms of one business owner who I suppose went on a bit of a journey around neurodivergence and inclusion more broadly, one of the things that she said was that bit about knowing and understanding the lived experience of your own team and using that as a starting point to kind of break down the fear that there might be in an organisational culture. She also said to understand the culture and ethos that you have as a business or as an employer, but also the one that you're trying to create. And she also said, finally, to be kind in your approaches and the culture that you're trying to create as an organisation. My own organisation has, in terms of lived experience, established a employee network group recently for disabled colleagues with a focus on neurodivergent colleagues. And going back to that point about testing approaches, we are testing an approach to the provision of neuro-inclusive recruitment practices, giving interview candidates questions in advance for a recent young talent recruitment, and we've extended that pilot to learn as we go, obviously with a view to implementing it as a whole organisation. And the final point I would make at this point in relation to apprenticeships in particular, we've invested a lot of energy in working with learning providers, contracted learning providers in the modern apprenticeship programme in particular, to spend time at that needs assessment point with new apprentices to really establish what their needs are and to try to reduce the stigma that undeniably exists about disclosure in the first place, to increase the confidence of apprentices to be able to be clear with their employers what would support them in the workplace.
Thanks very much, Fergus. Pam, back to you. Do you have anything to pick up on?
No, thank you, Chair, and thank you, everybody, for your responses. I will also give my apology. I will have to leave for an appointment now, but thank you so much for giving your responses. Thank you.
Thanks, Pam. And Rhoda, I know you were interested in some of this too. I'll bring you in now.
Thank you, Convener. And we've heard about how kind of small adjustments can make a huge difference to people, but they're not often put in place just because people don't understand or have awareness of neurodiversity. Can I ask what kind of small adjustments could be made and examples of where that's proved successful, and should maybe that be in place all the time without people disclosing that they've got a neurodiversity?
Thanks, Rhoda. I'll bring Jill in.
A local example for you, Rhoda. I recently went through a procurement process with the Highlands and Islands Enterprise, and I found the process to be, I mean, you'll all know the procurement system well, but the cognitive overload actually ended up, there was a form that appeared at the last minute, and I ended up, my application was 1 minute late. So naturally, I raised it with them, and to their credit, the head of procurement and the head of their Fair Work working group met with me, and we went through it. That whole process would have been so different for me if they just had a simple content sheet that explained where these bits of forms were. That would have been no cost to them. But because all the information was so dense, there was a form that just appeared that I didn't know anything about. I have an ADHD brain. I will always do things when it's like near the deadline. To me, 45 minutes is like a lifetime. You know, I think, you know, they could have that information. If they could show that information in 3 different ways, you know, have the dense information for the people that like the detail, have a content sheet for somebody who needs the step-by-step instructions, have a video for somebody who learns that way, and that would have made a whole lot of difference to that experience. Now, that had an economic impact on me because, you know, I obviously missed the deadline, and I didn't think how many people just don't go near the procurement process because of that. So it doesn't have to be anything fancy. It can be simple changes. It's about listening. But the other thing, important part of that conversation is that it needs to be done before. It's not about how could we have made that better. You know, we say that we've got equality impact assessments and everything else. So why was that like that in the first place? And I should add as well, to their credit, I thought the way that Hi actually dealt with that was fantastic because they took the feedback and are going to go and work on it. So thank you.
Thanks for sharing that, Jill. David, you wanted to come in, and then Mia and Al.
We had heard kind of mention earlier about disclosure, and that always seems like such a difficult word because it feels as if you're admitting something, doesn't it? And I know that word is quite problematic. We've been doing a lot of work recently around about conversations, which is about, and we've some Scottish Government funded work with a campaign called Why You Asking? And it's really about people having, and managers and employers having the courage to maybe ask questions as well and initiate conversations and maybe ask the daft question and the thing you're worried about asking, but also people feeling safe to have the conversation with their supervisors and managers in the workplace as well. And it's safe to do that. I mean, I think talking about the psychological safety and things, it's safe to do that. It's okay. And the understanding that every single person in a workplace has different needs. We've all got things that, you know, that we're confident about doing in our work, and we've got things that we're muddling through. You know, I'm sure that's not the case for MSPs, but, you know, but, you know, there's things that we manage our way through, and we have our coping mechanism to get through that kind of thing. So it's not that different, and I think educating employers about the fact that that is not that different to actually what you're doing in terms of adjustments for other people as well, and really promoting conversations. And one other thing that we're kind of initially dipping our toe into, and colleagues around the table might know more about this, is we're doing some work in reverse mentoring about senior figures in organisations being buddied up with disabled people, people who are neurodivergent, and that's about facilitating the conversations between them because there's a trusting relationship, and you can go and ask and get advice, and am I doing this right, and am I saying the right thing, and do you have ideas and thoughts? So that might be another kind of tool that might be useful.
Thanks, David. And yeah, MSPs muddle through an awful lot. Mia?
one of the first things I want to say is, and it sort of came up a little bit in the previous session with education, is that environments that benefit neurodivergent people benefit everybody. They're not disadvantaging anyone, and it's just best practice. And so we've already got, like, a lot of companies have online training management systems, and if we just add things to that, that's how we can get. I've seen where there's sort of infographics, you know, what happens if somebody has just disclosed something to you, and there's all the different options, very quickly pictorial, and these are really simple things that we can do, and they benefit everybody. I think we should be looking out not people opting in, but people opting out, so that they don't have to disclose. If we can take that out of the environment, then we've got something that's going to work for everybody.
Thanks, Mia. I think that point that you've highlighted from this morning as well is clear. Equality and inclusion is good for everyone. It doesn't disadvantage. Yeah. I think.
From the idea of adjustments and accommodations, why can't we just provide an environment that works for everyone?
Yeah, and that's systemic change. Yeah, Alan and then Marek.
Sure. So probably just to pick up on the closing comments from the last session, this is about people thriving, whatever that might mean to them. And just exactly as the points have just been made, it's understanding human to human how we can thrive. So this is not a deficiency. We have a deficit model when we think about neurodiversity still, I think, far too often. Our job, and many of us around this table and far beyond, are working hard to reframe that. It's about potential. We all have unique skills to contribute. To come to the question, Rhoda, the specific examples are many and wide-ranging, but the basic premise is they should be designed in for everybody. So whether that is assistive technology, whether it is interview processes where, for example, questions are shared in advance, and much more beyond, if we offer that up universally, I don't feel I have to say anything about how I experience the world, because I can access the tools that will help me to flourish in the workplace. So I think that's the kind of basic principle here. And there are so many examples. The key thing is most of them are very low cost. There's an assumption that there are all sorts of things you need to do that are high cost. They really are not. You know, some of that's freely available, but if they can be designed in for everybody, then that makes it far more accessible.
Before I come to Marek, can I just pick up on, they easy to implement, they low cost. What is it that's, in your view, what is it that's stopping people doing it? Is it lack of awareness? Is it fear? Is it a combination of a whole range of different things?
I don't think it's fear. I think a lot of the misunderstanding and stereotyping and stigma around neurodiversity is what gets in the way. We've found, without exception, when we begin to engage with employers, quite quickly we build better understanding and awareness. That leads to more human-to-human conversations. And then it is a natural process that organisations start thinking about much more than policies. How do we create, high-performing environments and environments where people can, access the tools and resources that they need? So probably lack of awareness is the key thing. And that's what we're all trying to tackle, I think.
Okay. Thanks. And sorry, Marek, Mia just wants to come in on that point. So.
Yeah, sorry. One of the biggest things is the double empathy problem. We've got a group of people that are swimming and a group of people that are climbing mountains, and they're both understanding each other's experience through the experience they're having. So what we need to do is try and get an understanding that person to person, but really understanding that there is a gap of understanding. And how can you have empathy and anticipate what the other person is going to need? And we need to work on that, really need to work on the double empathy problem.
Thanks, Mia. Marek.
I just wanted to make a point about legislation. Actually, the legal duty to make reasonable adjustments is, of course, linked to the definition of disability in the Equality Act. I think it's important to make a distinction between disability and neurodivergence more broadly. Many, if not most, neurodivergent people would meet the definition of disability, but not all. Second issue, of course, is that many neurodivergent people will not consider themselves as having a disability as well, regardless of whether they would meet the definition or not. And then the third issue, which was already mentioned, is a disclosure point as well, which is people are sometimes not willing to disclose this to their employer. the reason I'm making this point is that it can be a bit confusing, I guess, for employers to try and navigate the legalities of reasonable adjustments. Just to bring it back to that question, our advice would always be to go beyond the legal duty, of course, and to try and provide reasonable adjustments to everybody and have a conversation very clearly, openly with employees about what sorts of things would work for them. I think it's absolutely right to say that assumptions that this is something that's very costly are still very, very common. But there are very easy and cheap examples of what can be done to support neurodivergent individuals. Rhoda asked for specific examples. A specific example, for example, would be if you are in the physical workplace and you have a hot desking system that might not work for some neurodivergent individuals, so you will provide a fixed desk, fixed point of work for this one individual to come into work and work from the same desk. Providing noise cancelling headphones, for example, would be one as well. The most common reasonable adjustment actually is flexible working. The key challenge from our perspective with flexible working is that we have reached a stage, partly because of COVID, where flexible working is simply equated with home and hybrid working. Whereas that's not the case at all. There's many other forms of flexible working, some of which might work much better for neurodivergent individuals, things like flexi time, for example, or job sharing. I think we still need to improve employee understanding of what some of these options are and how they can help employees with various conditions.
Thanks, Merrick. Fergus, and then Kirsty online.
Yeah, I mean, it was just again to echo some of what's said, but to your point, convener, about why some of these simple changes are not being made so far. I think it is obviously partly a lack of awareness, but I think there is some fear as well. I think across a lot of equality and diversity, some employers fear getting it wrong, in inverted commas, and that leads to inactivity. But to your question, Rhoda, about practical steps, I kind of said earlier, one of the things that we're piloting at the moment as an organisation is that bit about giving people questions for interview in advance. And I suppose that's one example, but of a broader point about, I think we often design recruitment processes that mean that people perform rather than bring their authentic self. So again, to colleagues who have made the point already, that actually these simple changes will benefit everyone. And certainly my colleagues who have been trialling this in recruitment have made the point, why weren't we doing this already? And again, to echo the employer that I spoke about earlier, what she said in relation to inclusive recruitment was she's not trying to catch people out, she's trying to see the person through the recruitment process, therefore build up a more authentic picture of the people that she's trying to select in recruitment. So again, I think there's a point here, a principle here, which is about shifting our attention more from the pressure that's on neurodivergent individuals themselves to seek reasonable adjustments and to make the workplace work for them, towards the system-wide change that we need to see employers and the wider system make, that makes a difference to all individuals.
Thanks, Fergus. Kirsty.
Yeah, I just completely echo what's been said so far. I've been sitting nodding along in the background here. But in terms of why employers might not be implementing things like reasonable adjustments, we've heard that, as everyone said already, there's a sort of lack of awareness, and I think a lack of sort of concrete examples. I mean, the committee itself is asking for examples, which kind of shows that it's not really common knowledge what a easy sort of reasonable adjustment might be. And employers in our research have asked for sort of case studies, whether that's sort of live or online, in order to understand what a simple adjustment might be. And we also heard from employers about sort of not knowing where to go for that information, not knowing where to start. We've had experiences of employers feeling that the guidance that's provided is not strong enough, is not sort of concrete enough for them to feel they can implement it themselves accurately. And then in terms of reasonable adjustments, I think the big thing that we've heard is about flexibility for neurodivergent people. So no two neurodivergent people are the same, and that means no two neurodivergent people need the same reasonable adjustment. One example from our learning disabilities work, which I found really powerful, was so Down Syndrome Ireland worked with Specsavers, and they employed one young man with Down syndrome, and worked with him repeatedly to get the right job pattern for him, so that he could be present at work and be working to his full potential. And just through sort of that flexible kind of iterative process, they've now become the biggest employer of people with Down syndrome in Ireland. So it really can make a huge difference, these small changes, but it's sort of just accepting as well that there probably will be a bit of trial and error, and I think that's maybe something that's not as built into the systems that we have as it could be.
Mm-hmm. There's maybe also risk, isn't there? If it's trial and error and you get it wrong, what are the consequences of getting it wrong for the individuals, whether they're the employees or their employer? David, you wanted to come in on this.
Just to follow up on a quick point Kirsty made about employers wanting to find out where they can go to get information. And, they want to do things right. Where do I go? How do I do it right? Where is the information that I need and the kind of education that I need? And the reality is that in this area and in many areas related to disability, there's an enormous amount of information.
Yeah.
People produce stuff all the time. It's finding it's the hard bit. And there is, and I tell civil servants this every time I meet them, there's a need to pull this stuff together. There's a need for a resource for employers to find good quality information, and it would work wonders, I think.
Thanks, David. Jill, you wanted to come back?
Yeah,
I'll hand back to Rhoda.
Quickly, everyone's talked about the power of that human to human, and I think sometimes that is the answer, because there is so much information. And as Kirsty said, you've met one neurodivergent person if you've met one neurodivergent person. So it's about employers having the conversations with the people and about how they work best. It's, again, flipping that conversation of like, what is the environment that you need in order to work best, rather than what do I need to do in order to meet your needs? Because if there's a certain part of work that just doesn't work for their brain, then is there a way that you can get them working on the parts of the brain, that the parts of work that they absolutely excel at? And I've seen that. I've done it wrong as an employer. I've got ADHD, I understand neurodivergence, and I've got it wrong. I think it is hard when you have to do trial and error, but you're always going to get closer to the answer if you speak to the person in front of you.
Thanks, Jill. Mia, you wanted to come back in, and then I'll go back to Rhoda.
Thank you. I think we are so caught up in getting things wrong, and I think that starts with education. We're taught there's a right answer and a wrong answer, instead of actually saying that what we should be doing is aiming to fail as often as we can to learn. And I think one of the big things is there's a sort of a punitive culture that if you don't meet the capabilities and you're not performing, then we go down that HR route of, right, okay, your first warning and et cetera, et cetera. And if we could move from the punitive into the curious, so asking questions instead of blaming, we start with, well, okay, what's happened here? Why has this happened? How are you feeling? What could we have done different? What could you have done different? And we have a more curious approach rather than a punitive approach. I think then that worry about getting things wrong disappears. And I think that's a very easy cultural change that you can do. And I know it sounds weird, but to bring in something from fostering, we have something called PACE, Dan Hughes, which is playful, accepting, curious and empathetic. And if you can bring that into the workplace, it can help with a cultural change that moves us out of blame and into curiosity. And it's quite an easy a change of environment to establish.
Thanks, Mia. Rhoda, back to you.
Thank you. What I'm picking up from what people are saying is, the current situation where people require a diagnosis and then some lengthy discussion about what support and adaptations are put in place, that we should be mainstreaming this, that it should be part of every workplace, that we try and build it around the employee rather than expect them to fit. And if that's the case, we've talked about support for employers, and big companies will obviously have that internal structure. But how do we get that support to employers that they can assess their own workforce and their own workplaces to make sure that they're, accommodating and help them to get the most out of their staff? How do we do all that? How do we provide them with the skills? And if we're talking about smaller companies that maybe don't have, the resources to employ people to do that for them.
Thanks, Rhoda. Who wants to come in? Alan? Yeah.
I would pick up on a point that David made. I think it's for, certainly for private employers. I don't see that as a state function. I think there's adequate training provision out there. In fact, there's vast amounts of training provision out there for employers. That's the very work that we do, Rhoda, is we go and sit down with employers, understand the culture that they currently have, and Jill made this point, the culture that they would like to have and how we move towards that. A lot of it is training and education and understanding, but it's advice on policies, it's advice on reasonable adjustments, examples of that, and as I've said before, sort of designing in for everybody from the beginning. So there's no lack of information, advice and guidance out there. Perhaps the challenge is navigating through it and finding high quality, trusted resources.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Alan. Marek wants to come in on that as well.
I just want to pick up one of the last points that Rhoda made in that question, which is the organizational size difference. We do know that large organizations are much more likely to put efforts to train their managers to be neuro-inclusive. They are much more likely to have big HR departments, of course, dedicated people to these agendas. That's very different to small businesses, of course. And, especially given the last few years where small businesses in particular have been under extreme pressures in terms of increasing energy costs, but also employment costs, national insurance contributions, national minimum wage, etc. They are in, I don't want to speak for the FSB colleagues around the table here, but they are in survival mode. For them to find the time to look for this advice, especially if it's difficult to access, is a real challenge. That being said, there are real gaps in large organizations as well. Big differences between the private sector and the public sector as well. The public sector tends to do a bit better on this agenda. Some of it will be linked to additional specific duties, etc. But still got about 40% organizations saying that they don't do any training whatsoever when it comes to neuro-inclusion. That's from the report that I cited earlier. So yeah, there are real challenges, particularly exposed for small businesses, but large businesses as well.
Thanks, Marek. And Kirsty online.
Thanks. Sorry, I was just waiting for my mic to come off mute there. So I've recently done a review of the sort of employability programmes, policies, incentives across Scotland that are available to people who are neurodivergent and people with learning disabilities. And what's available is overwhelmingly focused on employability, so getting the employee ready for work. And I don't think that that's always the most appropriate route for neurodivergent people and people with learning disabilities. As we've discussed in the previous session and this session, there's sort of these structural problems where employers really do need better understanding of neurodivergence and training in how to support people with neurodivergence. So one thing that I noticed from that review was that No One Left Behind funding, for example, is very much catered towards employability and not towards employer-focused initiatives. And I think that, as others have said, obviously when private businesses can afford to invest in these things, they definitely should be. But when it comes to small businesses and the previous point about them being in survival mode, I do think there is potentially a space where government could be supporting that sort of implementation financially. I would love to see No One Left Behind being sort of broadened out a bit in terms of what local authorities can fund in terms of more employer-focused initiatives, or what Inclusion Scotland refers to as employer ability, because I think that's really important, and it would be helpful in terms of actually getting more employers on track. The other thing that we've heard from our more wider research, I'm thinking of our hospitality and in-work poverty project that I worked on, is that employers really appreciate when there is a level playing field, and the minimum standards are being brought up for everybody, because those who maybe go above and beyond what's statutory mandated can potentially be negatively impacted through competition and people being able to undercut them. So that's something that we've also heard from employers, is that raising the bar legally can also be a really good way of getting everybody moving in the right direction.
Thanks, Kirsty. Mia, you wanted to come in?
There's also the access to work funding. I know that tends to be more employee focus, but I'm wondering if it could open its remit. And I know that's more Westminster than Holyrood, but you do have access. Scottish people do have access to that. I've also, I've got a colleague that I've been speaking to who works with the DWP, and they are very interested in opening it up and the funding. So I don't know if that's somewhere that could be, conversations could be happening as well. But I do think we need to, it is very focused on the individual rather than the organisations. And coming back to environment.
Thanks, Mia. Fergus, you wanted to come in, and then Marek.
Yeah, I mean, it's not the point I was going to make, but following on from what Mia said, Access to Work have been running sessions for employers, sometimes quite large-scale sessions for employers to understand better access to work, and we've opened that up to contracted learning providers and apprenticeships and employers too. But in terms of where we've seen the most improvement in both participation and achievement in relation to disability and neurodivergent apprentices, although direct attribution of what we do and the improvement itself is quite difficult to say, one of the things that we think has made the biggest impact is a suite of CPD, high-quality CPD learning for training providers and employers, informed by lived experience. Lots of that is delivered by some of the third sector organisations you've heard from as part of this inquiry and that are here today. And that CPD that I referred to initially around effective needs assessment, those conversations with individuals and how to have those conversations, has been by far and away the most popular CPD that we've done with the learning provider cohort and employer providers as well, and been highly attended and evaluated and making a real impact.
Thanks, Fergus. Marek, did you want to
just on access to work, I would just support what Mia said there. Access to work has great potential. It's a very positive intervention, but it is chronically underfunded. The demand for that service outstrips supply many-fold. The waiting times for funding being agreed can lead to job opportunities being lost, etc. So, very often it comes down to funding. In this case, it is most definitely about more funding required for access to work.
Okay, thank you. Rhoda, back to you.
I think my questions have been answered, but what I'm taking from it is that we should be mainstreaming this rather than sending people off to get information at the point of need. If they should have that information long before time, so the barriers don't go up in the first instance. Am I right in what I'm taking from that?
Thanks, Rhoda. Yes, lots of nodding heads around the table. Sorry, Jill, did you want to come in on
Yeah,
on
it's
these?
just from a business perspective of remembering the cost of not doing this as well. Because sometimes we need the reality check as well is, people do not stay in employment if they do not have these conditions met. So I think that's always important to remember when we're having these conversations with employers as well. And like Marek said, they're feeling it, small businesses. They're feeling the pressure, and this is a direct impact of that as well.
Okay. Thank you. I'll move on then to questions from Marie McNair.
My line of questions has actually been covered, so I'll kind of stay out just now and listen to this discussion, maybe come in later on.
Okay. Okay. Thanks, Marie. Paul, over to you.
Thanks, Convener. And Alan, I had the pleasure to visit. We had a session down in Mindroom just a couple of weeks ago. And one of the key things I think it kind of came through then, we had a series of employers. But they were tended to be in larger employers, as maybe talking about smaller businesses as well. And larger employers had the capacity to take that on and can you organise their organisations around about the support for those with neurodiversity in terms of that. So, and I suppose the question is, how do we ensure there's that standard approach across different sizes of business? Because I think it's easier for a large business to do it. If you're talking about a small SME or small businesses, how difficult does that then become? And I'll open it up there, but that came through very clear in terms of that. And I think it's really important that we have that standard approach. The other kind of thing that was mentioned as well was almost in terms of the support that was there, but in terms of if there were difficulties, how is that then picked up? Because if somebody's employed, at the outset, their neurodiversity might not become apparent until later on in the process. And there was a few examples where people were diagnosed with neurodiversity, and then it changed the relationship, if you like, within the organisation. So I suppose both these questions, if you wouldn't mind. And then I'll open it up to Broad.
On the first one, we've probably referenced some of that. I think perhaps there is a case for more support for smaller employers to access, high-quality resources, training and the like. We've seen it make a huge difference in the employers that we advise, but they tend to be larger in the main. When, on the second point, difficulties arise, it helps an awful lot if you've got an organisational level understanding of neurodivergence and what can crop up. Unfortunately, some of the legal businesses that we work with do report from an employment law perspective. They're seeing more and more incidences of issues that are coming to an employment law team rather than being resolved much earlier in the business. So this could be performance management. It could even be, quite a few steps beyond that. So, things that we can do, I keep coming back to, is raising awareness, understanding. For organisations that have got capacity and resource to do that, that's great, and there's lots of provision out there. But perhaps there is a case being made here today, and probably, lots of other places as well, that there could be supports in place for smaller businesses. Just a final point on that, one of the reasons that we supply and support businesses with training and awareness is we were supported by the Workplace Equality Fund. That goes back about 3 years, but neurodiversity was not something that many employers were making progress with. I'm pleased to say that's changing, not nearly quickly enough as a lot of the research would bear out, but it is one of the mechanisms that actually made training and support available to organisations and sadly did not continue.
And that was mentioned there. I suppose the other question, and I'll open it up to see who wants to come into this one, it requires a culture change. So, I mean, there's one thing in terms of support, but do we need legislation? Because, again, I think that's something that we need to look at, because we can try and change culture, we can try and provide financial support. If there's not the culture within an organisation to do that, it becomes very difficult. So do we need, in your thoughts at this stage, legislation to make sure that that's going forward, that covers all our work areas? I don't know who wants to open up.
So
on that
I know David wanted to come in.
Just to follow on with the point that Alan was making, if you're talking about smaller employers that employ fewer people, I think there is a significant piece of work that still needs to be done that looks at the different models, the different tools, the resources that have been developed, and we've made the point there's lots of stuff out there. It can be often very challenging to apply that to a smaller business, and I don't think we've figured out enough of that yet. And enough variety and options and choices for those businesses and those individuals, so that that's working more effectively in a lot of areas. I think there are some challenges.
David, is that awareness, or is that a case of people are aware of it and need more help, or is it a bit of both?
Well, let's say if you're going to have a conversation about reasonable adjustments and things like that, if you're a 1 or 2 person operation and things like that, you're going to have to educate yourself about reasonable adjustments and how to go through that process and how to do it well and things like that. So that feels to a business that size like a big ask. Yeah. It's not a big ask for an organisation that's got an HR department and it's got people that do that kind of thing all the time. And the same argument can be made about legislation, because it's legislation that applies to everybody. And you might be placing demands. Now, We definitely want to see that raising of standards. We want to see much greater support for people. We know where we want to get to, but that will have other consequences if that's your pathway. You just got to be conscious of that.
Yeah, and the balance of where regulation hits small businesses and so on. So,
yeah,
get the point.
Thanks. Marek wants to come in, and then Jill.
Well, I think my general point would be that it's quite difficult to legislate for culture, for culture change. I did mention the Equality Act and the definition of disability in it. That is now 16 years old. I think there probably is a case of reviewing that and looking at whether it's still appropriate, especially in the context of the legal duty to make reasonable adjustments. One of your questions that you started with was how is neurodivergence picked up? And again, I'll come back to the whole culture of an organization. Talking about neurodivergence, talking about neurodiversity, talking about neuroinclusion, making sure, Fergus mentioned an employee resource group, for example, making sure that those get a chance to showcase their work, the resources that you have. I think that is a really big part of it. But I re-emphasize something that I said, I think, in my first answer, which is people management. I think people management, capability and capacity. And those are two different things. Capability is having the skills to have this sort of human-centric approach to management and being able to pick up signals, which might not be verbal signals, by the way, and then have a conversation with an employee. But also capacity. Capacity meaning having the time to actually manage people properly. And all the research that we've done shows that consistently around a fifth of all managers will tell you that they just don't have enough time to manage their people well. And that then goes back to things like workloads, job design, adequate resources to do the job, etc., job quality, broadly speaking. So,
thank you. Jill, I know we're going to come to you, but I suppose the one other point that Kenny came through as well when we went to Salvation Minded was in terms of, because we're talking about those who are in employment, but there's a lower level of people who have neurodiversity who then end up in employment in the first place. So how do we make sure that employers are taking that into cognizance, for example, in their selection processes, and making reasonable adjustments in a selection process? Because if it doesn't, they're already a disadvantage before somebody goes into an interview stage. So I think that's a really important point. We're talking about people there, but how do we make sure that people who are neurodiverse have the same opportunities as they go into employment?
Yeah, and none of it's easy, right? I mean, no employer works in a vacuum. We know that there's a lot of stigma, a lot of different opinions around neurodiversity. The issues around the NHS provision is causing way more issues in the private sector. All that is happening, and those employers are hearing all that, and it's a confusing situation for everyone. If there's support, they need funded support for small businesses. Small businesses, like you say, for them to be working on reasonable adjustments. And that, I know you make the easy choice, don't you, if you're going to employ someone. But for us as individuals looking at somebody, I much more think about now, if I'm employing someone, what kind of person is it I need to have in my team? So there's the skill set you need, but there's also the kind of person that's going to fit right in that culture. And then that goes back to the way that we recruit. Because you can make massive differences. And so somebody made if you're an autistic person, I mean, they'll be great in some roles. I wouldn't be great in that role. I'd be taking risks left, right and centre. So yeah, it's employers thinking about that, but we should also have funded support around them, which it sounds like Alan does a lot of work around that as well.
I suppose it comes just on the point you mentioned, it comes back to the point, because I think the last speaker, I don't know if you mentioned, talked about in terms of deficit. And almost a neurodiversity deficit. And what you say is a really important point, because it's a benefit. It's not in terms of what you're selecting, who you're selecting, and it's not. And I think that's one of the key things that was mentioned when we met about the stigma around it, and there is still a stigma. It's not a deficit. It's acknowledging the neurodiversity in terms of that and the benefits it brings a certain position and so on. So I think that's a really important point that you mentioned.
It's so important, Paul, because I think about even my own career. If I thought about the things that I'm not good at, the deficits, shall we call them, if I was going to an employer and putting that list up, when I got my diagnosis, Jill would be good at this and Jill is not good at this. If we just focus on the list of the things that I'm not good at, all that excellence is lost. And so it's about flipping the conversation, isn't it? And saying, what are those people excellent at? Because everyone needs someone that's excellent, right? In their organisation.
Good.
Thanks. I've got Kirsty, and then Fergus, and then Mia.
Thanks. Just to pick up on David's point about that piece of research that needs to be done, it's just to highlight that at the Fraser Islander we are aiming to do a larger scale survey of employers and business leaders related to hiring neurodivergent people and people with learning disabilities, and this is going to include questions on knowledge of neurodivergence and learning disabilities, barriers that employers feel they're facing, and what kind of support employers feel they need. So I'm very happy to share the findings of that survey with the committee once they're available, and if any of the speakers in the room feel that they'd like to sort of contribute to what that survey looks like as well, I'm very happy to sort of collaborate on that.
Thanks for that offer, Kirsty. I'm sure there'll be people in touch with you after this. But Fergus, and then Mia.
Yeah, I mean, it was just really to echo. I mean, the question that you asked, Paul, about do we need legislation? I mean, I don't have a view on the bill that hasn't been gone through Parliament yet in terms of the broader bill and pathways to diagnosis and all the rest of it. Obviously, that kind of sits to some extent outside the conversation we're having today. But in terms of employment, I think there is something the Royal College of Psychiatrists report talked about, maybe the need for a public health campaign that includes an element that's aimed at employers. And taking that point that you've made there around an assets-based approach for employers about the additional skills that neurodivergent people will bring the Scottish economy and employers and the workforce more broadly, I think there is space, perhaps, for that to be the case. I think the other thing I would say as well is in the public sector, both as employers ourselves, but also in terms of the delivery of our public sector equality duty, and how we improve programmes, I think that there is far more scope in the public sector equality duty than lots of public authorities employ. I know that as a committee you've looked at that more broadly, and it's just to say that some of the stuff that we're talking about here today doesn't happen in itself. You know, just because a public authority sets equality outcomes, that doesn't mean to say that that's spreading some kind of magic dust that the outcomes are going to be achieved. There's a lot of work that then needs to go into achieving those outcomes across the public, third and private sectors. And I think in some senses we've only scratched the surface of the scope and the potential to make improvements in what we've all described here today.
Approach obviously talks about the much broader cross-agency approach, and I think that's very much needed in terms of this. Now we're focusing on workplace and we're focusing on education, but it is that cross-agency approach that the RCP paper favours really strongly in terms of that. I think it's a really good point you made.
Thanks, Fergus. Mia.
Yeah, I've got sort of 3 points. Rather than with small businesses, rather than trying to focus in on the business, why don't we focus in on the professional bodies and focus in on things like the FSB? Because you're only having one conversation which is accessing a large group of businesses. So if they can be offering training, if they can be offering advice and consultancy, then you've got your small businesses. So that's my first point. Second point is legislation is for the short term, it's for now. But what we need to do is do a cultural change, and that starts in schools. We need to have people growing up with the idea that everybody contributes in a meaningful way to society. So, I mean, I think there will be a big burden on businesses if we bring in legislation, but it might bring up standards in the short term while we're trying to do the long-term strategy. The third one is what Jill was saying. I've seen evidence where, and it was sort of talked about in the education one as well, about sort of almost having, rather than having exams, having a sort of an idea, almost passport, a professional passport. These are my strengths. And if people could turn up with jobs saying, look, this is what I'm really good at. You know, I'm really good at deep focus and procedures and systems, or I'm really good at creativity and innovation, and I know how to use emerging technologies. All of this makes it easier for the employer to go, I know exactly where I can use you. And when that's done, the research shows that you can get up to like 90% retention. So people are not moving on.
And again, that's really important, because I know it was mentioned when we had the meeting in the mindset was in terms of retention rates are also lower with people with neurodiversity as well, and that shouldn't be the case. But it is at the moment, so I think that's a really good point.
Thanks, Mia. Alan, you wanted to come in.
Pick up on what Mia's said. We've seen that in practice, and it's very effective. So a lot of the employers that you might have met, Paul, they are looking at passports, for want of a better term, or they already have them implemented, where if you move from team to department to, you know, function within an organisation, the unique strengths and capabilities you bring, again, positive, not deficit, they go with you. And therefore, the things that will enable you to thrive are accompanying that as well, rather than having to start again. The point, I suppose, that was made earlier is that people leave people or stay with people. You know, organisational culture is part of that, but the point that's been made around people managers, line managers, that's the population that we often do the most work with, because it's equipping them who are, you know, on the, I suppose, front lines is a terrible term, but they are having the conversation with, you know, the neurodivergent employee and vice versa. So they're the ones that I think most benefit from tools, resources, you know, how to have those conversations and how to help people flourish.
Thanks, Alan. Jill, you wanted to go in?
Very quickly, you know, just to pick up on the passports, I have a Working With Me method that I go out and present to leaders around neurodivergence. And what we actually find is so many of those leaders then recognise stuff within themselves as well. So I think the education isn't just about the employees, it's the employers starting to recognise potential neurodivergence in themselves. So you're opening the door to a whole new world for them as well. So just wanted to pick up on that.
No, thank you. Fergus, did you want to come in?
Yeah, similarly, a quick point just to pick up on the discussion that's been had. We're actually, at the moment, user testing a development of the My World of Work platform for young people in particular, but potentially for all people, which kind of proposes that kind of theory of a passport, a learner profile that will go with you through your career journey, and also that's very much built on, rather than built narrowly on qualifications, that it's much more about achievement more broadly, and also with a focus on skills and meta skills, as opposed to the narrow way that we might assess young people or people in the labour market traditionally, and also that it's a passport that is informed by the needs of employers in the Scottish economy, so that learners can be clear about where they can contribute.
Thanks, Fergus. Alan, do you want to come back in? Yeah, of course.
It's not to build on that point. If there is space to do so, I'm very mindful of your time as a committee. There is a dimension that we haven't talked about today, which is parents and carers in the workplace, and we've just done quite a big study, and the results are actually quite revealing. So we'll share that with you, but I can give you some headlines at an appropriate point if there's time.
I'll come to that. I think there are a couple of things that I was going to pick up on just from that conversation, but thank you. I'll if I don't, just shout at me, and if I forget. It's really that tension between whose responsibility is this, and you said, is there a role for the professional organisations, for the FSB and others to provide either the training itself or the collation of resources that are available. Is there also thinking about who else is involved in a workplace? Is there a role for unions and trade unions? Because they're also the people who support employees to pick up the pieces when things go wrong. How can we in this place facilitate those kinds of conversations if it's not through direct legislation, because although it might be, but if it's not through that, because we recognise the burden that puts on particularly smaller businesses, what else can we be doing to support those conversations, to support that facilitation? And David, I see you wanting to come in.
You mentioned the trade unions, and I would like to see the trade unions doing a lot more, but I would like to see them having more positive conversations about changing cultures, as opposed to quite a lot of what we've observed, and I'm not saying this is always the case, but quite a lot of what we've observed is this is your legal requirement as an employer, and it's not about your legal requirement, it's about moving beyond that, and it's about changing culture and having the conversations, and which benefits everybody. So it's not about the legal demand, and I think when you frame it in that kind of way, you're starting off a kind of negative position to have a conversation, and you want to do something a bit more positive than that.
And of course, there might be cultural or historical reasons why they start off on that point. But I take that. Mia, you wanted to come in.
I mean, we do have sort of mechanisms already. We have conferences and exhibitions that businesses are part of. Why aren't we having a presence there? Why aren't we doing conferences? Why aren't we turning up at business exhibitions and saying, OK, look, this is why this is valuable to you as a business? I think it's about looking at existing infrastructure and seeing where we can use it, where we can get the trade unions in, rather than trying to recreate new. Let's build on what we've already got.
Thanks, Mia. And I know, Kirsty, you wanted to come in on this.
Yeah, thanks. Another thing that already exists, going back to sort of No One Left Behind and kind of the wider employability landscape, is local employability partnerships. And I think that when these work in the way that they're intended, they're really, really powerful, and they're a really great way for multiple different types of organisations to work together to improve things for neurodivergent people. And so I think that potentially using LEPs as a forum for these kinds of conversations and sort of, again, broadening that out to employerability and employer-focused interventions could be really, really powerful as well.
Thanks, Kirsty. Jill, you wanted to?
Yeah, and actually, Kirsty, I sit on the Highland version of that partnership working, and it really does work great in practice. I have to get in, like, when you're asking the question about work, you can't sort of ignore the question around the NHS and the provision. In the Highlands, and I'm sure it's similar in every other place, the answer to the waiting list was just to remove everybody from the waiting list that wasn't in actual crisis. And we cannot think that that doesn't have a huge impact on the work and the ability for people to get out and work. If we're going to wait for people to get to crisis point before we even intervene, then we are failing. We're failing them, we're failing businesses. And again, in my introduction, I said I'm a perimenopausal woman because that's important in this context. I'm an employer, I'm an unpaid carer for my chronically ill husband, I'm a business owner, and when I reached perimenopause, my brain stopped working. Now, we know scientifically that there's a really close link between dopamine and oestrogen. We know that to be true. It's not disputed. And yeah, even though I've got a private diagnosis, everybody was taken off the list in Highland. So that was the way to deal with the situation, even though we waited like a year and a half. And by the way, I'm in a privileged position. I pay for my own CBT therapy and everything else. So I just despair at the thought of what that's like for anyone else. But in reality, I have a private diagnosis using the exact frameworks that the NHS use. Yeah, I can't get care through the NHS. I also said to my doctor, right, I'll pay for it privately, which again is a danger to me because I think, well, how do I know they're giving me the right medication? And because, as you know, there's no shared care arrangement, she's saying, well, actually, we wouldn't be able to deal with your other medication if we did that. So I'm sitting here from a privileged position, but also somebody who is trying really hard to be economically active as an employer, somebody who's responsible for my household income. And, nothing. The one time I had to call on the NHS, there was nothing there available. And to think of those people that are trying to navigate the world of work in that position, I can't even think what it's like for them. And I think that when we talk about how we support employers, how we support employees in the workplace, we have to fix the fundamental issues with our mental health services. And I know it's not easy because I know in the Highlands that's competing with people who've got depression, other mental health issues, suicidal and all that. But that's where we really need to do the fix. So thank you for allowing me to kind of take it off track. I just think that's an important point.
No, thanks. And I don't think it's off track at all. I think part of what's led us to some of the issues we face is the siloing and the compartmentalisation and not seeing the holistic picture. And that certainly came through very, very strongly in our first session this morning when we were focused on education. Now might be a time, Alan, for you to bring in your conversation about parents and carers, looking at that whole picture of people.
Well, that's just it. We are whole humans, aren't we?
Mm.
So we're more than just as we appear as an employee and employer. Last year we supported about 2,200 children, young people and their families. We find, very often that the patterns that they see in their young person then lead to questions about perhaps their neurodivergent as well. That then obviously has ramifications in the workplace. The basis of the research we focused on, however, is does having a neurodivergent young person at home where there might be additional caring responsibilities, does that lead to any downward pressure on you as an individual, as a family unit? Does it limit your ability to be economically active? Overwhelmingly, the answer is yes. So this study concluded at the end of last year. We're just writing it up, and that will be published in the end of the first quarter. 96% of respondents reported negative health and well-being impacts. 74% changed working patterns due to caring for a neurodivergent young person. It's important to state 87% of respondents were women. And so very often when school says, would you like to come and collect your child, it's not really a question, it's a directive.
Yeah.
It is mothers that are doing that overwhelmingly. It's mothers who are, inevitably reducing hours, perhaps not able to work full-time or otherwise. So there are some fairly big findings here. And of course, it doesn't take a genius to figure out there is downward pressure on living standards for people. So not only have we talked about the benefit of creating a better culture, we're talking about creating, a more economically active population as well. So the more we can remove the barriers that exist within the workplace to understanding neurodiversity, what we've found without exception is the wider that then permeates. It's not just about, I wonder if we could have better conversations, I wonder if we could improve recruitment. It then extends into, what about the body of carers that we've got? And actually, are they able to fulfil their full potential? And if not, what can we do about it as employers? So, again, we will distribute that to the committee when available. We'll disseminate much more widely as well. But it's very revealing. Not a surprise, because we've heard it anecdotally, but it's good to have an evidence base.
No, thanks, Alan. Mia, do you want to come in?
On Alan's point, I've had live experience of that as a foster carer. I actually had to give up my day job because I was getting the school were phoning me up to come and pick up the young person, and they didn't want to exclude, so it was an unofficial, under the table kind of, can you come and pick them up? We think they need time out. And I was getting so many phone calls, I actually had to give up my day work. So it is definitely happening out there.
And that is it's a failure to recognise the whole person, isn't it? And the whole family, the whole community that we live in. There are just a couple of other points that I'd like to pick up on from what we've already heard. And apologies, I can't remember who it was, but somebody talked about reverse mentoring. David, I thought it might have been you. And I think that's a really, really nice example of doing things a little bit differently. Are there other examples that you have either as employees or working with employees of the support that's available for the employees, but also that can support the employers and the workforce in general, colleagues, to better understand why that person thinks the way they think and that kind of thing? David, do you want to come back in?
I think just things about, educating employers how to do consultations, which sounds like a really official, formal process, but actually to do that in quite informal ways, which is kind of what reverse mentoring is part of that, It's about establishing pathways for people just to communicate and share pieces of information and share learning and what's working. And I think they kind of started off talking today about this whole thing about constant feedback loops from people who are going through processes and experiences and how is it working for them and how do we make it work more effective, and understanding that the kind of the person-to-person thing that we've been talking about. So I would certainly say that mechanisms that help people consult but without it being formal, if that makes any sense. Informal consultation.
Yeah. Mia?
I literally earn my living from doing this. I mentor people from who are potential employees. But one of the things I tell them is go find the person who's doing, is gold standard best practice within your company, and go and talk to them, see if you can build a relationship with them, see if you can get that sort of reverse support and that unofficial mentoring. And I think if we had more practices like that, where people with experience can sort of take somebody under their wing and really help them advocate for themselves, I think it would be a really, really useful. And I know companies like Microsoft and Ernst Young and SAP are doing that and finding really good results from it.
Great, thank you. I suppose one of my other points was around just trying to connect the threads from what we heard in this morning session on education. And one of the comments, because I know not everybody was there, but one of the comments made was teenage young people who are struggling in schools, not attending because the schools can't or won't or haven't made reasonable adjustments, or something changes and they can't cope. I'm wondering if we're thinking of assessments and the qualifications that we have in schools and the requirements for exams for those types of assessments that actually aren't beneficial for people with different forms of neurodivergence. What role can employers play in making our curriculum do better, if that makes sense? And I'm looking at you, Fergus, hoping you're going to come in on this, because it seems if we have a solid body of evidence, very, very clear examples of why curriculum for excellence doesn't quite get it. It could have, but doesn't quite. What is it that we need to be doing differently so we do actually have the information coming out of coming with the young people as they leave school that actually helps them and assesses them in a more rounded way? I don't know if that question makes sense, but it's been going around my brain for a bit.
Yeah, I think so. Convener, thank you. There's some things I would say. One is the Career Information Advice and Guidance service that Skills Development Scotland deliver is obviously traditionally associated with schools, but increasingly our CIEG service is delivered in community venues in partnership with local employability partnerships, with third sector organisations, colleges and in other settings. So we hope that the potential of that to engage with non-attenders in school, I think there's a lot more that we could do there in terms of increasing that scope, and then maybe also thinking about other platforms that people might engage with in terms of digital platforms, My World of Work and all the rest of it. But to your question there, I think as well, going back to the panel, having heard the panel, the round table earlier today, it's that bit about traditional qualifications not suiting everyone, and so the opportunities for experiential career learning, for work experience, foundation apprenticeships, where that type of and broader achievement that's outside the school, so informal learning, volunteering, and how we help young people through learner profiles and passports, and as we've kind of discussed earlier, how we help support young people identify and then communicate to employers or in further education or training what their skills are in a confident way. I think that's essential, and obviously employers are central to the effective delivery of foundation apprenticeships, experiential career learning, and there's partnerships with lots of the industry bodies that we've talked about and that are around the table here today to make that come to life and to make that a reality. And then ultimately it's about how do we measure that learning. I think that came up earlier. How do we measure schools? And that broader learning, I think, needs to be a core part of that.
Thanks. I've got Mia, David and then Jill and Mark.
Hi. I think the biggest problem we've got is that our schools are trying to create workers for a 19th century Victorian workforce, factory owners basically. And I think until we look at that, we need a system that is going to actually create workers for the future, but we don't know what the future is going to look like. That's the biggest problem. But we do have some examples where some schools are doing that. The Alpha School in Texas, in America, it's using AI, does 2 hours of AI, individualised. The AI is individualised the learning to that person. And then the rest of the time is all about life skills, building work experience. I mean, one of the things I saw was that one of the classes rented an apartment, and they set up an Airbnb and run it, and that was their project for the year as a group. And that's just one example, and there's outdoor learning. And so I think we need to really look at emerging technologies and see how that can be used. I think also when I was first teaching, I was involved in something called an enterprise week, which the school did, which was absolutely brilliant. Off timetable for a week. They were given a project. It was you know, sort of engineering based, because that's my background, is DAT. And they were given a project. They had to produce something, and then businesses came in and they ran workshops. So the bank manager was there giving a thing on profit and loss. There was somebody from HR. There was somebody else who was manufacturing. And the kids, they produced a company. They were mixed up. They weren't allowed to be with any friends. It was an amazing experience. And the really great thing, the person who ran it, was that it wasn't just a development thing for the children. It was actually a development thing for the staff as well, because we learned a lot from that. And that was a really great way that we worked with industry. And the kids loved it. The young people just were, it was, you know, we all had fun.
That's a great example. Thanks for that. David?
I don't have much to say. I didn't actually signal that I wanted to speak.
Oh,
but I will take the 30 seconds just to say that I don't have much expertise in terms of education, so I won't say much on that, except to take the opportunity to say we always need much stronger transition. We might need much better planning for young people that's focused on their gifts, their talents, their aspirations, and setting people up for success. And we still have a lot to do on that.
Okay, thanks, David. Jill, and then Marek.
You stole my line. No, I'm joking. The future of work, designing for the future of work. But also, I think young people have got great ideas, right? There's a room full of them here. But actually listening to young people, because what I'm seeing with young people coming into the workplace is they are just redesigning the way of work. They're kind of forcing our hand a little bit, aren't they? And I, for one, love it. So it was more of an observation.
No, that's helpful. Thanks. Marek.
I was just going to link what Fergus said to the sort of recruitment process. We do know that still employers tend to recruit based on qualifications, which obviously is problematic when we know that disabled individuals, neurodivergent individuals are less likely to have formal qualifications. So we would encourage employers to think about skills-based recruitment. That's one of those things that could help in the transition of young people, young neurodivergent people into employment.
Thanks, Marek. Alan.
I'm stating the obvious here. It's been made regarding public health provision, but there is chronic underfunding and lack of support in schools as well, as I'm sure you'll have heard this morning. So, the biggest ask is capacity build. No amount of resource and information is going to have the same impact as an education meeting a young person where they are. And that is the formative experience they take with them into the workplace. So if you've had generally negative reinforcement based on this sort of deficit of you should be able to do this thing in the same way as everybody else, that does impact you culturally and socially for a very long time. And we see that repeatedly. So as people move into the workplace, again, lots of us don't like the word disclosure, but if we have better conversations, there is stigma and fear for good reason. It's because of negative past experience and the perception that actually this could all happen again. I could be judged. So I suppose just coming back to the core point, it's probably out with the realms of one committee, but chronic underfunding is a huge, huge problem. What we can do, however, is provide supports for people now and not wait for that to be contingent on assessments, because that, I don't think, is ever going to be resolved.
No, thank you. And I suppose, as David was talking about the need for transitions, I think it just flagged again for me the comments this morning about the distinction in support available if you have or don't have a diagnosis, and what that does to you as an individual, whether you disclose it or not, what that does for people around you as well. Yeah. But Mia, do you want to?
I think also that we need to build in agency so that people, because one of the things in schools, it's very teacher-centric. And I mean, I was sitting there doing the maths last night. In a 60-minute lesson, an individual in that class will get 1 minute and 1.76 minutes of that particular time. Yeah. Take out settling time, that's down to 50 minutes, so that's 1 minute, 1.42. And then, you know, if you've got people who need more help, then you're going down to like a minute, and it just gets so, trying to rely on the teacher to do it all, I think, is really, really difficult. So can we give our pupils more agency? And if they have agency in that environment, they're going to have agency in the work, and they're going to be able to advocate for themselves, and that is going to make them better employees and us better employers.
Yes, thanks for that. I think that's a very, very important point. We've come to the end of questions, I think, unless any of my colleagues want to pick anything up. No. But for those who've joined us, is there anything that you want to make sure we hear? Anything that you want to either reiterate or that you haven't had the chance to say? Now's your opportunity. Christy wants to come in. Go for it, Christy.
Thanks. Yeah, just something that I've raised before in other parliamentary sessions, but the data for neurodivergent people's employment experiences and people's learning disabilities continues to be really poor. The Scottish Government have decided not to continue to boost the annual population survey, which means data is going to be changing. So I'd just like to highlight to the committee that it's really important that whatever new data ends up being chosen, we try and make sure that neurodivergent experiences and different conditions that fall under neurodivergence are included, particularly in employment data, so that we can really track when interventions are being made, how successful they are, because if policies are not sort of backed up by evidence, then we don't know whether they're working or not.
Thanks, Kirsty. That's an important point. I see, Fergus, did you want to come in on that? It was just really to agree. I mean, that's been an important part of the journey that we've been on with apprenticeships and modern apprenticeships in particular, is that ability to disaggregate and to know where we're making improvement and where we need to focus.
Thanks. Mia and then Jill. The biggest problem I have is how we've medicalised this. Everybody's brain is it's normal. We're expected to have different architecture, and that comes from the way that we're brought up as much as what we're born with. So I have a problem with it being medicalised, and the fact that also that our brains are plastic. It's just because we're neurodivergent doesn't mean that we can't grow and we can't change, and I think I would love to see it coming out of a medical model into a more general, this is human beings and we're messy and fantastic and amazing, and can't we find room for all of that?
Thanks, Mia. Jill?
Yeah, just rejection sensitivity dysphoria features so much with neurodivergent people. It has such a huge impact in the workplace, and I wonder if, in the future, this committee or somebody in Parliament could do a bit more research around that and think about the specific impacts of that, because I think we'll see that impact a lot more in the future.
Okay, thanks. That's a helpful suggestion. Any other last comments from anyone else? No. Well, thank you very much all for your time today. Really, really appreciate it. It's been a wide-ranging and really rich session. So that concludes our formal business in public, and we'll now move into private to consider the remaining items on our agenda. But just to say thank you again, everyone. Really appreciate your time.